Pepper's mom called and asked if he had left another milk jug outside. The young man shouted to his mother that he had taken out everything from large dishes to plates. She looked at him and said that now a lot of rainwater will collect. The young boy smiled and ran into his mother's arms. He asked why they were collecting water. She looked closely at all the dishes that were on the street and said that it was not just water. She said that these are fairy drops in which fairies are born. Pepper was surprised and asked his mother if fairies are born in rainwater. The woman looked at her son and stroked his head. She said everything was right, because in a place where enough magical water collects, a fairy is born. The fairy of the forest is born in stingy water, in an old tree, is located in a puddle, in a crack. Between the rocks and in the flowing river, the water fairy is born. She looked at her son and said, "That is why this water is called fabulous." The young man was surprised. Peter looked at his mother and asked her with a smile if they were collecting rainwater to make a fairy. His mother looked at him and said that, unfortunately, man is not able to create a fairy, and they collect this water to use it as medicine. The young man was surprised. Together with their mother, they gazed at the raindrops. Only those fairies appeared in the world who themselves wished for this. Dark possessions of death. These dark possessions are called destruction. Their existence interferes with the happiness of people. People live very bright and wonderful lives. But if the destruction spreads, everyone will become miserable. You need to be strong to fight death, but the darkness is very powerful, deadly, and merciless. She knew that, like darkness, she could do her own destruction, and she liked it. In a dark dungeon, she will become the strongest darkness. Looking around, she didn't understand where she was. She saw a dark and narrow room, but the earth led her here. She knew it didn't matter because it was dark enough to become darkness. But among all the darkness, she saw a little boy. She didn't understand who he was. She didn't understand what the little boy was doing in such a cramped room. She noticed that the young man was tied up. Everyone else laughed joyfully. She didn't understand why the boy had such a devastated expression on his face. She thought that perhaps he simply had no soul. A man burst into the dungeon where the boy was sitting. He furiously attacked him and told him not to fuss around and soon I would leave. The young man was scared and surprised. The man shouted to the young boy to follow him. She didn't understand why the man behaved so rudely towards the child. She couldn't believe that the little boy was locked in such a place, since there was nothing here that could make him smile. She thought that perhaps today was a particularly bad day. With this thought, she watched him for several days. She saw that every day he was called somewhere. After the boy was locked up with meager food. After time had passed, the boy was taken outside again. But still, the boy looked at her endlessly, as if afraid that she would disappear. She knew, in truth, that he was constantly trembling with fear. The boy looked at her because of his loneliness and sadness. She wondered if he could experience emotions. She sincerely wanted to make the boy smile. She wanted to show him the happiness that people experience outside these walls. She hoped that she could show him the beauty of the outside world. She wanted to show the beauty of a magnificent city or village, or the close-knit family visible outside the window, but she knew that it would be difficult for her to do this alone. Something she could handle alone, and something that could only be felt by seeing her simplest beauty. She wanted to become his flower. The little boy saw a bright glow and was surprised. He saw a beautiful flower of unearthly beauty among the dark dungeon. A moment later, he saw that there was someone in the flower. A beautiful fairy looked at him from a flower. The young man was surprised. He didn't expect anything like this. The little fairy flew closer to him and greeted him. The fairy kissed the boy and said that she really wanted to meet him. She looked at him and said with a smile that she was very glad to meet such a little man. She said she was a flower fairy. She looked at him and said that during all this time, she had a lot of questions. She asked him where they were and how they got here. She was surprised that he didn't say anything. She asked him how old he was and what his name was. The flower fairy really wanted the young man to answer her as quickly as possible. She said with a smile that she was a fairy who had just been born, and that she too did not know many things. The young man looked at her intently and carefully. He was taken aback and didn't know what to tell her. The young fairy looked at him intently and asked in a trembling voice if he was really cooking. She saw that he looked at least 6 years old, but I was puzzled by the fact that he couldn't talk. It's natural for people at that age to talk. She wondered if the big people here hadn't taught him how to speak. She realized that he had not even been taught words. She didn't know why he was pulled out of prison every day. The fairy of flowers looked at him intently, and she did not like this whole situation. She wanted to teach him to talk. She said that when he learns to talk, they will be able to tell each other interesting stories. She said that she had stories that she really wanted to share with him. The flower fairy smiled and said that she was here and really wanted to talk to him. She looked at him and asked him to answer yes. She wondered if he could say a simple yes. The flower fairy looked at him and said with a smile that she really wanted to make friends with him. The young boy was surprised. He looked intently at the fairy, and in response, the fairy looked at him with a smile. In the blink of an eye, the boy picked the flower. A moment later, he caught the young fairy in his hand. She was surprised and did not understand what was happening. The fairy was surprised by the little man's action. She frantically begged him to wait because she wanted him not to hurt her. A man entered their dungeon and opened the door with rage. He looked at the boy and told him to hurry up and get out quickly. The man saw that the boy was hiding something. The man came closer to the boy and asked what kind of grass it was. He was furious. The man looked at the young man and asked what he just ate. He was furious. The young man looked intently at the guard. The guard looked at him furiously and asked if he could even hear him. The little fairy was shocked that the boy had just swallowed her. She said she was having trouble breathing and wanted to get out. She frantically begged him to let her go. The guard looked away from the young man and sighed with a smirk. A moment later, he hit the boy and asked if he was going to answer him. The boy took the blow from the guard. A moment later, he fell to the ground with a crash. The fairy, in turn, screamed. She was surprised and asked the boy what it was. In a trembling voice, she asked if the guard had hit him. She said she couldn't believe it because the boy had done nothing wrong to deserve the hit. The young fairy asked why the man did this to him. The man looked at the boy with a contemptuous look and showered him with insults. He saw the remains of the flower and asked with contempt whether the boy really ate the grass. The guard came closer to the boy and angrily told the boy to spit out what he was possessed by. The man was furious and did not understand how the boy could ignore him. He furiously hit the boy again, only this time a kick to the stomach. The man frantically shouted to him that he would now explain everything if he did not understand the first time. The man shouted for the boy to spit everything out. The flower fairy was shocked by everything that was happening. She felt very sorry for the little boy. She didn't understand how a man could mock an innocent boy like that. The man mocked the boy. The fairy frantically begged the boy to let her go, since the person would not be able to see her. She said in a trembling voice that people who are not allowed will not be able to see the fairy. The man, in turn, screamed furiously and continued to tell the boy to spit it out. The fairy was in shock. She felt very sorry for the boy, since he was undeservedly beaten. She whispered pitifully, "Enough is enough." A moment later, she burst into tears, as she wanted all the boy's torment to end. A moment later, the boy spat out the contents. The guard saw the remains of a flower on his hand. He stared at the boy for several minutes, but later turned around and left. The fairy looked at the boy who was lying beaten and asked in a trembling voice if he did this to protect her. She looked at him and asked if he thought that if a man saw her, he would lose her. She looked at him and cried. She said that he was a stupid fool, since she had said earlier that she could only be seen by the person she allowed. She looked at him intently and said that she could leave. But a moment later, wiping away her tears, she asked for his forgiveness and said that he was the bravest child in the world. The fairy looked at him and said that she would certainly teach him to speak, since she really wanted to make friends with him. She looked at him and said that he should speak up, not hit him when someone does it. She said that he should use words like beautiful and tasty, and also the word like. The fairy looked at him intently and said that she hoped after training he would like her. She looked at him and asked if he would say that he liked her. The young fairy showed the boy a beautiful flower. The fairy asked whether he liked it or not. Since this is the flower in which she was born, she looked at him and with a smile told him to repeat after her and said flower. The young boy made an incomprehensible sound. The fairy was afraid of him. She was puzzled and told him to first repeat what she told him. She looked at him and told him to say the word flower. A moment later, he tried to say the word flower, but it turned out a little differently. But still, the fairy was very glad that he made a mistake in the word and changed only one letter. She smiled and said that he was almost perfect. Of course, she knew that the pronunciation needed a little work. She said that if he continued like this, he would be able to pronounce words like her. The fairy flew closer to him and said with a smile that he was a very smart little boy. She looked at him and said with a smile that now he can try it because there is honey in the flower. The young man looked at her in surprise and bewilderment. The fairy looked at him and asked if it was tasty and sweet. The boy was shocked. The young fairy smiled and asked if he should begin his training with the word delicious. She knew it was a taste that only he knew. The fairy smiled and said that even among many fairies of flowers, she is endemic, and only he knows about this flower. Even only he could taste this honey. The boy looked at her in bewilderment. She looked at him and asked if he wanted to know if there was more. She flew closer to him and asked for forgiveness, since the fairy's power is limited, and she could not use it in large quantities at one time, since she was still a very small fairy. She smiled and said that the fairy's power is called vitae. This is the meaning with which a fairy is born. An idea about herself and about the world appeared in her head at birth. For example, a hare is an animal with elongated ears, or that young creatures need love and attention. She looked at him and said that it was probably too early to tell a child about this today, who barely understood one word. She looked at him intently and did not understand why he could not receive this unconditional love, given such shining eyes and a beautiful voice. She didn't like it all. The little boy recognized the fairy immediately, and thanks to him the fairy exists in this world. This was her sweet first person. The fairy saw that people were torturing the boy. She was furiously angry with them, and wanted to make them all regret it. She thought maybe she should have been better off becoming a fairy of darkness. The boy said the word honey with a smile. The young fairy was very glad that he was able to say the word. She looked at him with a smile. She looked at him with a smile and said that he pronounced everything correctly. She was surprised that he smiled a moment later. He said the word flower. The young fairy flew closer to him and kissed him on the cheek. She said with a smile that he said everything correctly. The fairy said that the boy should learn this way, one word at a time, but the most important thing to her was his smile. The young fairy enjoyed his smile. She realized that she had made the right choice and became a fairy of flowers. The first word she taught him was the word flower. She was grateful that she could show him a beautiful flower. She was very happy. The fairy looked at him with a smile and said that she wanted to teach him a lot of things, and she remembered what they needed most. The young fairy looked at him and said with a smile that they needed names. The boy looked at her in surprise. He did not understand what she was talking about. The fairy said that they both had no names. The fairy said that she would find a beautiful name that would suit him, but that will come a little later. Yawning and stretching, she said that she was starting to feel sleepy. The young fairy smiled and said that she would go to bed, since the younger the fairy, the more sleep she needs. She looked at him and said that most likely he would not understand what she was talking about. The young fairy saw that he began to close his palms. The fairy sat comfortably in his palm and asked the little man if he was one of those people who hide everything. She knew that, however, this was a completely different feeling from the one she experienced when he swallowed her. In this silence, she heard the boy's breathing, peaceful and soft. She thought that she should have said goodnight to him after all. She thought that tomorrow she could try teaching him how to greet. The fairy felt the warmth that came from his warm hands. Her peaceful, quiet sleep was interrupted. She woke up and didn't see the boy. She looked around the room in surprise and puzzlement, as he was nowhere to be found. She realized that soon I had taken the whole little boy, the big man who had previously beaten him. She was furious because she couldn't allow this to happen again. She saw a door through which the child could not pass at will. But for her, the door did not pose any problem, for the same reason that that man did not see her. Until the fairy acknowledges something, it has no effect on her, even if it's an inanimate object. The young fairy walked through the door with ease. Flying through the door, she saw just a staircase that led upstairs. She was surprised because she realized that the little boy was locked on the lowest floor. They were in room number 4. She knew that there was no one in the other rooms. As soon as she climbed the stairs and passed through another door, more than 100 doors appeared before her eyes. And behind these doors, she heard frantic sobs and suffering. The fairy walked through the door and saw a crying child. He was devastated. Many of the children muttered in alarm. However, there were even more of those who lay with empty eyes like her new friend. If he had not met the fairy, perhaps he would have become just like them. She looked at the children and wondered why little people were in such a place. She did not understand what crime they had committed. Looking closely at the child, she saw that he had a number, like everyone else, but she was still puzzled by the fact that her new friend did not have a number. She understood that he was locked in such a place for some other reason. Previously, she thought that this was a very strange place, but after what she saw, she was convinced of it. The fairy decided that she would continue up the stairs. Sometime later, the fairy was breathing heavily, as she was very tired. She didn't understand where she was, because it seemed to her that it was a prison and labyrinth. The higher she rose, the more unfamiliar the surroundings became. There were people walking around wearing dark clothes, and they looked like the man who beat the boy. There were still people in each room, but along the walls were the most terrible instruments of torture of all kinds. Moreover, due to the winding path, she did not have a single guess as to where they could be and where the exit was. The fairy was puzzled and did not know if she would be able to get out if she followed this path. She knew she was running out of energy. She wanted to see one more room and then come back. Looking into the room, she saw a man eating cookies. The young fairy was surprised that she saw the cookies. Looking closely at the cookies, she realized that they were with chocolate. She was shocked and wanted to take him away. The fairy wanted to take it and share it with her new friend. The fairy was a little puzzled because the cookie was too close to the person. If she bumped into him, he might notice her. She knew that at such moments she could not do anything. But still, she decided that she needed to use fatares. With the help of the vital force accumulated in fate, fairies can take advantage of a unique ability, which only they own. It is called fatares. She decided to use the fatares transition now, magic that helps to pass even through a living being. She knew that if she touched a person, he would not catch her. She really wanted to take the cookie. She knew that even a small cookie would suit her. The fairy passionately wanted to bring the boy all the good things in this world. She desperately wanted to see him smile. Still, the fairy managed to steal the cookies. It was hard for her, but she continued to fly along with the cookies. She was very tired, as she had lost a lot of strength during fatares. She felt like she was going to collapse at any second, but she was very glad that she was able to do it. She took away the chocolate chip cookies and really hoped that she would soon be able to give them to the young boy. She hoped he would really like the cookies. The young fairy flew smiling and hummed a song. She was very curious if he would show her his sweet smile again. She forgot her original goal. Smiling, she overcame the wall and joyfully shouted to the little man that she had returned. Smiling, she said that she had brought something truly amazing. She smiled and said that he would definitely like it. But suddenly, she looked at him and saw that he was sitting on the cold floor and bursting into tears near a flower. The young fairy was shocked. She didn't understand what happened and why he was crying. The young boy muttered something incomprehensibly. The fairy looked at him and asked whether he was hit or not again. Because I saw that he was crying and his fingers were all wounded and bleeding. She didn't understand what kind of cruel person could do such a thing. The boy hugged the young fairy tightly and cried furiously. She realized that now he was crying because of her. She knew that he probably thought she had disappeared. He cried and looked for her. She looked at him and asked for forgiveness. She said she didn't know he would be so sad for her, but she still looked for him. The young fairy tenderly wiped away his tears and said that she promised that she would not leave him alone again. She looked at him and asked him not to cry. The fairy looked at him and said that when he cries, it becomes very painful for her. A moment later, she remembered that she had brought him cookies. She looked at him and said that as an apology, she would give him a gift. She looked at him and said that he had probably never tried cookies. She realized that he had never had the opportunity to eat chocolate chip cookies in prison. The young boy stared at the cookie. The young fairy smiled and said that the cookies were definitely very tasty. The fairy heard an incomprehensible crackling sound and looked at the boy in bewilderment. The little boy broke the cookie and gave it to her. The young fairy was surprised. She looked at him and asked if he offered to eat together. She was very pleased, smiled, looked at him, and asked if he wanted to eat together. The young fairy looked at him and realized that she had already made a decision. In his absence, she wanted to continue exploring this place. The fairy frantically wanted to find out why the boy had to suffer so much. She sincerely wanted to help him. The little boy was the first person she allowed to see her, because he was the owner of a smile that made her happy. The young boy smiled and said that the cookies were delicious. The fairy was surprised. She was very glad that he said the word. She looked at him and said with a smile that she was very glad that he had learned another word. She also said that he was a great fellow. Smiling, she said that he was truly the best person. The little boy really liked the fairies. The boy and the fairy slept quietly and silently in a damp dungeon. The fairy woke up and wondered how long she had been sleeping. Stretching, she looked at the boy and asked if he slept well. She saw that she was very dirty and was surprised. She still decided to ask the little man about it. The fairy understood that she would have to wash herself using her power. She decided to use a drop of water from the source given to her. She was very happy, because now she was cleaner. A moment later, she saw a little boy. He woke up, she looked at him and asked with a smile if he slept well. The boy looked at her in surprise. The young fairy smiled and asked if he was surprised. The fairy flew closer to him and said that this is an ability that only fairies have. She said that she wanted to wash him too, but unfortunately, this ability only applies to fairies. The fairy smiled and looked at the young boy. She said she was very glad that his wounds healed quickly. She also said that the swelling on her cheek had subsided, and surprisingly, the wounds on her lips had already disappeared. She looked at him and said with a smile that she thought he was truly a special child. After coming here, she set herself several goals. She looked at him and said that she was not honey, but a fairy. The first goal is to teach the little boy to speak. She looked at him and said with a smile that she didn't need to eat it. The second goal is to someday reach the surface with him. The boy looked at her and said with a smile, "Don't eat." The third goal is to find a name for him. She knew that such a cute child could not help but have a name. The young fairy smiled, flew closer to him, and said that everything was true. If he gets a little confused, he can determine everything with his own eyes. A moment later, their conversation was interrupted, and they heard a noise. The boy and the fairy looked intently at the man who came to pick up the boy. Her last goal is to find out what the boy went through. The man looked at the boy with a furious look and told him to get out. The fairy was furious because she realized that the man had come again to take away her friend. She decided that this time she would not send him alone. The young fairy flew closer to the boy and quietly whispered in his ear not to worry, as she would immediately follow him. She asked him if he understood that this man could not see her. The man looked sideways at the boy with rage and told him not to mark time and to quickly follow him. The fairy quietly whispered in his ear to behave as if he did not see her. The fairy was surprised and did not understand why the boy did not react to her words. She looked at him confusedly and realized that now he was pretending. She was surprised and also amazed. Looking at him, she realized that he was happy and cute. The fairy wanted to kiss him right now, but she knew that she had to hold out until the last, since she could not knock him out of the role he was playing. The young fairy sat on his shoulder and followed him, walking with the little man through more than 100 rooms. They went up to the next floor, and eventually they arrived at a place that had no sign on the door. But what she saw after opening the door were people unknown to her who looked suspicious. They were dressed in white robes and masks, and she also saw a creepy-looking bed. She looked around intently and did not understand what kind of place this was. One of those present looked at the boy and told him to lie down on the bed. The young boy quietly obeyed. The man looked at his companion and told her to check the condition of the child. The woman looked at the boy and said that his condition was satisfactory, and there was nothing strange. The young fairy was puzzled. She did not understand what satisfactory meant. She knew that he had been beaten yesterday. The fairy was shocked. She didn't know what these people were going to do with him. The man calmly said that he was going to administer Regent number 8. They took turns administering different types of medicine. A man with glasses was writing something in a notebook. The fairy was puzzled because she looked at the notebook and did not understand what he was writing. She looked closely at the notebook and saw an entry dated February 701. It wrote about strengthening the cornea, improving the limbic lobe, improving the femoral muscle, and the first psychological correction. The young fairy was scared because she understood that no matter how you looked at it, it didn't look like recording and treatment. She did not understand what kind of psychological correction it was. The man looked at his companions and told them to stop and told them that they needed to move on to the next stage. The woman came closer to the little boy. A moment later, a small ball began to shine near the boy. The young fairy was shocked as she realized that the woman was using a skill from the realm of the mind. A moment later, the fairy became even more frightened as she realized that the woman was using the mind control skill. The woman looked at the boy and said that he was just his master's tool. The boy, without opening his eyes, whispered that he was his master's tool. For several minutes, the woman brainwashed the boy, and the young boy said that he obeyed his master and that he did not think or reason. She looked at him and told him to repeat that he had no self-control. She continued to use mind control for some time. Opening his eyes, the boy said in a trembling voice that he could not control himself. The young fairy was shocked because she saw that her friend was repeating the same words. She was shocked, and she understood that only for the sake of the owner, he could not help but think or control himself. The fairy looked intently at the boy and did not understand whose desire it was. She knew that even this baby might want something tasty. He was able to admire beautiful things. She knew he had the will and resistance to mind control. The fairy looked intently at the drugs that were injected into him. The fairy was puzzled, and did not understand why some master would take away the right to choose from a small child. She knew that he had not even appeared in the maze. The fairy knew that no one could be the owner of the beautiful boy. She passionately wanted to free him from the shackles that bound him every day. She knew that even if such a person exists, then the one who is able to make the boy happy must be chosen by the boy himself. The young fairy looked tearfully at the boy and said that she would certainly find the owner. She asked the boy not to give in to this whisper. She flew closer to him and said with a smile that they would never do something like that to him again. The young boy smiled. His smile was short-lived. The people present in the room were surprised that the boy smiled. The fairy looked at him tearfully. She frantically begged him not to give in to the whisper. She was very glad that he smiled at her. The man was shocked that the boy smiled. The woman looked at him, puzzled, and asked what he said. Because she knew that this was simply impossible, since she was sure that her mind control was definitely working. The man who was closely recording and watching the boy said that the boy definitely just smiled. He looked at the woman and told her to increase her consciousness control. The woman was a little puzzled and said that the boy's intensity was already high. The man looked furiously at his companion and asked if she had forgotten about the recent incident with the weed. He said the fewer risks, the better. He said the boy doesn't need emotions. The young fairy was furious. She didn't want them to hurt him. The woman looked at her companions and said that she was finished. She was surprised that the repulsion force was enormous. The woman said that the boy has incredible willpower. The man looked at her and said that this was truly surprising, since this psychological correction had been developed for 10 whole years. They were puzzled that some weed had undermined its effectiveness. The young fairy was surprised, as she realized that we were talking about her flower. The man furiously continued to write down information. He said that this was the child who caused trouble for Octarim himself. Solaru. The man said that it needs to be repeated 10 more times, and the intensity should be maximum. The woman looked at him and said that she understood everything. At this point, they completed the correction. The boy was taken back to prison. The fairy, in turn, was a little glad that the boy was not beaten. But even though he wasn't beaten, she was still very angry. Their correction and what they did was very strange. She didn't know whether it was for him or not, but she was sure of one thing. He didn't want it. The young fairy gazed at the boy. She saw his empty eyes. A moment later, she looked at him with a smile and mentally asked him not to worry, since she was with him now. Approaching the dungeon, she was surprised because she realized that this was not their room. The guard furiously pushed the boy and he fell to the floor. The guard looked at the boy and asked if he liked the new room, without a single ray of light. The guard said that while the boy was here, he would try hard to decorate his old room. So the boy didn't have to worry. The man said that not a single blade of grass could grow there anymore. The man looked intently at the boy and asked with a grin how he dared to avoid his gaze. And the man also asked why he was trying to hide an incomprehensible weed. The man said the boy must have been looking at him with a grin. When leaving, the man told the boy to wait for him, as next time it would be even more fun. After the man left, the young fairy flew up to the little man and asked if he was okay. The fairy said that the man was a very bad person. She didn't understand how he could lock the boy in such a small room just because he wanted to have a plant. She didn't understand how he could treat him like that. She was furious and said it was just an insignificant plant. A moment later, she said that she still took it back, since it was an unusual weed for him. She thanked him for lovingly caring for her flower. She looked at him and said that the man was right, and it would be very difficult for a flower to grow in the room. She smiled and flew closer to him with a flower in her hands. She looked at him and asked if this flower would be enough for him. The little boy slowly extended his hand to the flower. The boy gazed at the beautiful flower. The fairy was very glad that the boy finally smiled. Here they spent several days. In the end, they could not grow a blade of grass, and they were able to return to their abandoned room. The guard looked at the boy with contempt and said that a gloomy room suited him better. He said that from that day on, he would keep a close watch on the boy. The man said with a grin that the boy should be careful and called him number 4. The young boy gazed after the leaving man. The young fairy was surprised that the man called her friend number 4. She was furious, because she knew that this could not be the name of her friend. The fairy flew closer to him and told him not to worry about it. The fairy smiled and said that she would definitely come up with a more beautiful name for him. The boy muttered something incomprehensible. She smiled and said that she was a fairy. The boy looked at her and said that she was a fairy. She flew closer to him and said that he said everything correctly, and well done. She repeated once again that she was a fairy. The fairy was very worried as she had to make an escape plan and also provide him with food. She understood that for this, she would have to leave often. She didn't know if everything would be okay. She looked at him and thought that she should teach him now. The fairy flew closer to him and told him to look at her. She thought that she needed to let him know that she would be back, even if he couldn't see her. She said that from now on, she would often disappear for a while, but she would return immediately. So he will have to wait. She looked at him and asked if he understood. Looking at him, she realized that he didn't seem to understand a word. She realized that she needed to show him directly. The main essence of the Fatara's transition is the concentration of energy, this origin, inside and becoming a spirit. In other words, demoralization and becoming invisible to the human eye. Now she has become invisible to the young boy. The boy looked puzzled at where the fairy was. A moment later, he looked around the room and muttered something. The fairy realized that he was looking for her. She didn't know whether to show up now or wait a little longer. A moment later, she appeared before him in her usual form. The boy muttered something puzzled. The fairy smiled and asked how he was. A moment later, she saw that the boy began to cry. The fairy looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect this. The boy called her in a trembling voice. The fairy was shocked, because looking at the boy, she realized that she had made a very stupid mistake. She understood that what he needed now was not study at all. She understood that he needed someone's warmth. The fairy flew closer to him, as she wanted to calm him down. She promised that she would protect him, but she made him cry again. She didn't know what to do to make him stop crying. She didn't understand what she needed to do to make him smile again. She wanted him to smile again when he looked at her. A moment later, she took on the form of a human. She looked at him with a smile and told him to come to her. The boy was surprised and slowly extended his hand to her. The young fairy hugged him tightly. She was very glad that she was able to share her warmth with him. For some time, the young fairy sat and hugged the boy tightly. Moving away from him, she said that she was very angry. She didn't understand why he had to be locked in such a place. She didn't understand why. He was constantly being beaten. She said he should eat normal food, not something that tastes like garbage. She looked at him and asked why he was required to live for others and not for himself. The boy looked at her in surprise. She looked at him and asked if this was his whole world. The boy looked at her in surprise and did not answer. The young fairy looked at him and said that she, as before, thought that he did not understand anything. She looked at him and said that, of course, she was still weak, but she really wanted to save him. She said that she sincerely wanted to show him good things in the outside world. The fairy said that if he wanted, they could run away from here together. The young boy looked at her intently. A moment later, he smiled and said that he agreed with her while calling her a fairy. She was surprised. The fairy looked at him intently and asked if he answered her. The little boy smiled and confirmed her words. She was shocked and also very happy. Since he answered her, and most importantly, he answered her of his own free will. The young fairy was very proud of him, as he was very cute. With the speed of lightning, she hugged him and kissed him on the cheek. The fairy smiled and said that she had decided everything and knew about him. She said that she would find out the reason why he was in such a place. The boy was embarrassed by Fanny's action. She said with a smile that she would teach him words so that they could talk a lot. But most importantly, first of all, she said that they would become friends. The little boy looked at her intently. The young fairy smiled and said that they were friends now. This was her first friend, and she sincerely wanted to do something for him. The young fairy realized that she had been in this form for too long. It was very difficult for her to be in this form. A moment later, she returned to her form. The young fairy flew closer to the boy and asked for his forgiveness. She said that she would like to spend more time in human form with him, but now it seemed that this was her limit. The young fairy smiled and said that sometimes she would turn into a person and hug him. The fairy said that now it is necessary to focus on his training. The boy agreed with her. The next day she flew into the room and said with a smile that she had returned. The boy greeted her with a smile. He was very glad that she returned. The fairy flew closer to him and said that he was doing well, because he was waiting for her and didn't even cry. The boy was surprised, because he did not understand the meaning of the word well done. The young fairy smiled and said that he was a great fellow. The boy looked intently at the fairy. A moment later, he pointed to his cheek and repeated that she said he was doing well. The young fairy looked at him in surprise. She asked in confusion what he meant by this. A moment later, she looked at him and asked if he wanted to ask for a kiss as a reward. She realized that for this reason, he was humbly waiting for her. She was surprised, but also said that if he liked it, then she was ready to kiss him any time. A moment later, she flew up to him and kissed him on the cheek. She looked at him and was surprised, as if he understood what she was saying. He smiled brightly. The fairy wanted to teach the boys many things. She knew that if they joined forces, one day they would be able to get out of this prison. Sometime later, the boy was taken away again. The fairy was shocked by what she saw. She understood that time was running out for them. The mind control in the 5th stage was too cruel. Each time he returned in a terrible state. Even despite the fairy, the boy simply fell to the floor and fell asleep like a dead man. The young fairy, unable to hold back her emotions, cried tearfully. She frantically asked for his forgiveness. The fairy felt helpless, unable to protect him, and she cried endlessly in pain. The woman looked closely at the boy and told him to lie down on the bed. The fairy looked at the boy. She couldn't do anything about it. She didn't understand why they continued to do this. Her heart was breaking from the torment he had to endure. She screamed furiously and asked them what they would get from abusing the child. She looked at the boy in surprise and asked him if he was angry at all. She cried and asked him to say something. She said she was very sad and very angry. He told her to wait. The young fairy was surprised. The boy looked into the distance and told the fairy that he would return and let her wait. Having said this, the boy pushed her out the door into the laboratory. She was shocked and looked at the door in surprise. The fairy understood that the boy wanted to go through this alone, but she didn't understand why he said that. Sitting on the floor in the dungeon, she did not understand why he sent her away. She wanted to give him strength by being next to him. She remembered their last conversation and realized something. The fairy realized that the boy was very worried about her and therefore pushed her out. She was very sad about this. She realized that he did not want to show her how he was suffering because it would be hard for her to watch. That's why he told her to wait. Sitting on the floor, she reproached herself and ordered herself to pull herself together and not become limp. She knew that there was no time for tears now, since she had to think about how she and the little man could escape from here. She looked at the door and asked for his forgiveness, since he said to wait for him. She knew that she simply could not leave him alone in such a place. She couldn't let him feel that kind of pain alone. She knew that in order to leave here with him, she would become stronger. The fairy knew that she would do anything for him. A moment later, the fairy flew through the door. She heard people talking. The man asked what the results of dynamic visual acuity were. The girl replied that the indicators had improved. The man looked at the notepad with a grin and wrote something down. He said with a grin that it was very good. The girl looked at him and said that everything was going smoother than before. The man said it was all thanks to the weed incident. The man looked at his companion and said that after the deprivation of his precious thing, the meaning of the last resistance was gone. The man said that the boy had completely given in to them. The young fairy was shocked by what she heard. She did not expect this. She was in shock and did not understand what they were even talking about. The woman looked at the boy and said that thanks to this incident, the name of the visas was even born. She said that it suited him very well, since viz in translation meant weed. The man looked at the boy and said that he completely agreed with her, since such a name was very suitable. An insignificant boy. He looked at the boy with a grin and congratulated him on his name. The young fairy was shocked by everything. The fairy was shocked by what she heard. She did not understand what name they gave him. She didn't understand how they managed to completely suppress his inner selves. She looked at him and wondered if the point of resistance was completely lost. She flew closer to him because she wanted to find out if it was true. The fairy looked intently at her friend, who lay quietly on the terrible bed. She heard the man say that she needed to continue further. The fairy was shocked and wanted to know if it was true that he had lost the desire to leave the dungeon with her. The fairy flew closer to him and called him. The boy caught her. She looked at him closely and timidly asked if he was okay. The boy hugged the fairy tightly. The young fairy looked intently at the boy. She was surprised by his action. She looked at him and asked in surprise if he was missing. The boy only smiled in response. The young fairy was a little puzzled, as she thought that something was wrong. She said that if his self really disappeared, then he would not be able to look at her with such a smile. The young fairy decided to try to do the same thing that the woman did. The fairy looked at him and asked who his master was. The young boy looked at her intently. He was surprised by her questions. She looked at him and told him to answer, and asked him again who his master was. She realized that he could not answer her question. The young fairy realized that he was not hit by the spirit skill. She realized that he was only pretending to be brainwashed. She was very glad that he managed to deceive them. The young fairy looked at him with tears in her eyes. The fairy flew closer to him and said that she thought she had lost him forever. She looked at him and said that he was a great fellow, and she was very happy. The young boy was very happy. The fairy looked at him and said that those people called him a weed and an insignificant one. Weed because of their desire. She looked at him and said that he definitely should have a better name. The fairy said that she needed to go outside. The fairy looked at him and said that she would go and find out something about him, and then she would find out his real name. She looked at him and said that she wanted to give him a name that would convey love, not number 4 or visas. She flew closer to him and said that she would certainly bring him something tasty, so he should wait quietly for her. The boy looked at her and agreed. The fairy was very glad that he understood her. The fairy flew through the door with the speed of lightning and shouted to him that she would return soon. With the help of the Fatara's transition, she passed through the ceiling. Then she reached the spire. She flew further and further. She didn't know if she could get past the peak before the energy ran out. But still, she knew that she could overcome everything and get out with the boy. When she got out, she saw the top of the tower. The young fairy looked at the dungeon in surprise and intently. Besides this, she saw a beautiful view. The young fairy saw a beautiful city that was near the dungeon. The fairy was very surprised. She could not take her eyes off such beauty. The young fairy was very happy and smiled at such beauty. She was very glad that she was able to get out, as the gust of wind was very refreshing. She felt the same feeling that she experienced when she was born into this world. The young fairy was very happy and decided to later tell the boy everything she saw. She knew that they were together and exploring how spacious and wide this world was. She wanted to know how beautiful things there were and what goodies it is full of. Just thinking about it made her feel great. The young fairy decided to immediately go to the village. The man shouted to buy different weapons. He also says that they sell hemostatic healing and refined pills. The woman looked at him and said that the scabies crystals were grade 4. She looked at him and asked if he thought the price was reasonable. The fairy looked at all the people from a bird's eye view, who walked the streets. The young fairy flew closer and heard the man asking the woman if she had entered into a contract with the Fairy of Protection. Also, the young fairy heard a lot of interesting things. She was interested in everything. She looked at everyone in surprise with a smile. She knew that due to the fact that the village had the domain of destruction, many things useful in battle were sold here. The man was asked where the fairy does not fall from. The man looked at the interlocutor and said that it was too expensive to buy through an intermediary. The other man, in turn, said that if a fairy caught his eye, he would instantly catch her. The young fairy realized that she needed to be careful so that she would not be noticed or caught. The young lady heard someone say fairy. She was surprised. The young fairy gazed at the older fairy. The fairy looked at her new friend and asked her whether she was a fairy or not. When the fairy began, she realized that in front of her was a real fairy. The fairy looked at her new friend and asked when she was born. The flower fairy modestly said that she was born in the area from a fairy drop. The fairy looked at the flower fairy and was amazed. She said that she was a newborn Ison and was born on uranium. She was amazed. From the conversation, the flower fairy realized that fairies rarely appear in such a place. She didn't know about the number of fairies in each region, but could only understand the Ison. Ison is a word that denotes the level of a fairy. Fakes are classified into levels depending on the number of their attributes. The first attribute is Isten, the second attribute is Ferial. The third is Biakalis, the fourth attribute is Kranfa, the fifth attribute is Eula. The last level is the Fairy Lord. Most remain with the title of Bakalis and 3 attributes. Only a small number reach Kranfa. The fairy smiled and said that she was a Kran fairy. She also said that she was very glad to meet the young fairy. The young fairy was surprised that her first meeting was with a fairy of great rank. The young fairy noticed that her new acquaintance had been looking at her with great friendliness just a minute ago. The fairy looked at the flower fairy and asked what her name was. The young fairy smiled and said that she did not have a name yet. The fairy looked at her and said that it seemed like she was born not long ago. The fairy looked at the young fairy and asked if it was her first time at the market. The young fairy smiled and said that it was so, and she was still looking around. The fairy looked at the young fairy and asked if she should give her a tour. The exact fairy smiled and thanked her new friend. She said that she had used up all her energy, so she would have to return soon. The fairy said that it seemed that her destiny was empty. The fairy looked at the young fairy and told her to extend her hand to her. A moment later, a bright light illuminated the fairy. The young fairy was surprised, because she realized that the energy of Pei Vita was flowing into her. The young fairy looked at her companion and said that it was already full. The fairy smiled and asked her for forgiveness. She said that the Eason's Fatuma is very small. The fairy looked at her new companion and said that since she had a lot of energy, they could do something interesting. The fairy looked at the young fairy and asked what she wanted to do. The young fairy said, puzzled, that first of all she would like to find a watch and bread. The fairy looked at her companion in surprise and asked why bread, since there was something more delicious. The flower fairy looked at her companion and asked if bread didn't taste better than cookies. The fairy smiled and said that there was an attack, but there was one, and asked if the flower fairy would like to try it. The fairy looked at her companion and asked what she preferred. A moment later, she pulled something interesting out of the portal. The fairy smiled and handed the young fairy cotton candy. She told her to try it with a smile. The young fairy was surprised. She asked her companion if it was the Fatara's door that opened the fairy star. The fairy looked at her companion and said with a smile that everything was right, and this was a convenient Fatara's like a pocket. The young fairy nevertheless decided to try how cotton candy tastes. Taking a bite, she was amazed, because it was very tasty. The fairy looked at her companion and asked if she liked it. The young fairy said with a smile that it was very tasty, and asked if she could take it with her. The fairy smiled and said that she could do whatever she wanted. The young fairy smiled and said that she wanted to share with the human child who lives with her. She said that, unfortunately, he had never tried anything like this. The fairy was surprised and asked who this child was who had never eaten such a thing. The young fairy looked at her companion and said that there was a reason for this. The fairy angrily looked at the young fairy and asked if she had really become a contractor. The fairy was puzzled because she knew that the young lady was not yet able to do this. The young fairy smiled and said that this was her precious first friend. Therefore, if there is something good, she wants to share with him. The fairy looked puzzled at her young companion and told her to separate from him. The young fairy looked at her companion, puzzled, and said that she could not do this, since she really liked him. The fairy looked away, puzzled, and said that she expected such an answer. The fairy looked at the young lady and told her not to worry too much. She said that people are very capricious, and they live in a different time. The flower fairy was puzzled because she knew that her friend was not capricious, since he always looked at her with a smile. And when she transformed, they became the same age. She knew he wasn't living in a great time for her either. She knew that the boy was no different from her. The fairy sighed heavily and said that it was okay if she didn't understand her words now. The fairy patted the young fairy on the head and said that she was still very small. The fairy looked at the young lady and with a smile said that she was giving her this cotton candy and asked her to place the cotton candy in her star. The young fairy smiled and said that she would certainly do so. A moment later, the fairy transformed. She looked at the young lady and said that they could go find some bread and a watch. The young fairy smiled, and they walked slowly. The fairy looked at the young lady and said that she chose the watch and gave the money. She also said that when buying things, you need to pay money. The young one was especially a little puzzled. She asked what to do if there was no money. The young fairy asked if she could just take the goods. She said it was better not to do that, since even this can worsen relations between people and fairies. Therefore, to prevent this from happening, the fairies made rules. She said stealing and harming people is prohibited. The fairy said that if you break the rules, the executive fairy will come and destroy the core. She said that if you follow the rules, you can enjoy good things. The fairy said that she would introduce the young fairy to one of them. They slowly entered the bakery. The fairy smiled and opened the door. The fairy said that this is a bakery looking at the pink-haired fairy. The fairy saw a lot of goodies that were on the counter. She was very surprised, as she had never seen anything like this before. The fairy looked at the young fairy and said with a smile that this bakery, which is run by her friend, has very tasty bread. A moment later, the baker approached them, and he greeted them with a smile. The baker's name was Mamingo. He was an employee of the Berry Berry Bakery. The fairy greeted Mamingo and asked him for 2 pieces of cake. The young man said that he would do everything now and asked them to sit down at the table. The young fairy looked at her companion and asked who this young man was. The fairy smiled and said that this was the worker hired by her friend. The fairy looked at her companion in surprise and asked if it turns out that he makes bread and cakes here. The fairy smiled and said that everything was true. The fairy smiled at her friend and said that the young man was good, so that she could appear in front of him. She also said that she would introduce them later. The young man brought them cakes. Mamingo looked at the fairy and asked why she decided to try 2 pieces of cake. The fairy smiled and said that she was not alone and she would eat with her friend. The fairy looked at the young fairy and asked if she would show herself to the young man. A moment later, the young man saw the young fairy. He looked closely at the fairy and said that it was the first time he had seen such a cute fairy. The young fairy was surprised. She didn't understand why she was cute. She looked at her friends and asked if she was cute. Her new friends confirmed that she was cute while smiling. The young man looked at the cute fairy and asked what her name was. The older fairy said that she did not know, since the young fairy had not yet decided. The fairy said that you can't ask her about the attribute yet, since usually the attribute is also presented along with the name. The young fairy stared intently. She was looking forward to trying it. The fairy saw that the young lady was very hungry. She wished her bon appétit with a smile. The young fairy also wished her companion bon appétit and flew up to the cake with the speed of lightning. After the young fairy tried a piece of cake, she said with a smile that it was very tasty. The fairy laughed and asked if it was so delicious that she even cried. The young fairy was shocked, as she had never tasted anything tastier. She knew that cotton candy and chocolate chip cookies couldn't compare to cake. She knew that she couldn't be the only one who would try such a delicious thing. The young man looked at the young fairy and said that she left a lot. He looked at her and asked if she didn't like the cake. The young man was a little surprised, because he knew that she really liked it. But for some reason, she didn't eat any more. The fairy looked at the young man and said that the young fairy just wanted to take the cake to her friend. The young man looked at the young fairy and said that in that case, he would give her some bread and she could eat with her friend. The fairy was surprised. She looked at him and asked if she could definitely take him. The young man looked at her and said with a smile that, of course, it was possible. The young fairy looked at him and said with a smile that he was indeed a very good person. The fairy said that she would certainly repay him for his kindness. Mamingo looked at the young fairy and said that she could come with him and choose what she wanted. The fairy slowly flew after the young man. She saw flowers. The young fairy looked at the young man and asked if he liked the flowers. The young man said that he really liked them, but he could not buy them often because they were expensive. The young fairy was surprised. The young man said that they were expensive because it was not easy to grow plants in their region. The young man looked closely at the fairy and said that due to the fact that they were located next to the domain of death, it was difficult to grow flowers. Even if you grow them, they will quickly wither and die. This is life next to death. It's like living in gray. He said that may be why most people like flowers. Just by looking at them, everyday life comes alive. For this reason, flowers reduce people's fatigue. The young fairy gazed at the flower. She didn't know whether the young man would like her flower, but she really wanted to repay him. He looked at her and said with a smile that she could choose. She realized that since he said that he liked flowers, he would certainly like her flower. He looked at her and asked if she had chosen what she wanted. The young fairy looked at him and said with a smile that she had chosen, and she would like strawberry tart. Misha smiled and told her to wait a little, as he would prepare everything. The young man looked at the young fairy and said that along with the strawberry cake, he gave her a baguette and the remaining cakes. The fairy looked at her young companion and told her to place them in her star before they cooled down. A moment later, the fairy handed the young lady a watch. The young fairy looked intently at her watch. The young fairy looked at the young people and said that they were both like real angels. The fairy looked at the young man and said that she would try to help the young fairy until she got used to the human world. She asked the young man if he would help the young fairy. The young man smiled and said that, of course, he would help, since he also wanted to look good in the eyes of the little fairy. He was very happy, because for a long time he had not met a fairy who he liked so much. The young man looked at the young fairy and said that he was very glad that they met today. He also said that if she needed help, she could contact him at any time. The young fairy was very happy and grateful to them for their support. The fairy looked at the young lady and said that she would like to give her some advice before they parted. The fairy said that people here should not be trusted. She said that they were unusual because they lived near the domain of doom. She said that there are plenty of people here who will not hesitate to do something unpleasant. Silver also said that the young fairy would never go out at night, because at night the influence of death becomes stronger. The young fairy smiled and thanked her friend for her concern. Silver looked at her young companion and told her to be sure to say her name the next time they met. The young fairy smiled and said that she would certainly do so. The young fairy said goodbye to her friend. Silver stood for a while and watched intently as the young fairy flew away. The young fairy slowly returned back to her friend. She felt a pleasant wind. The young fairy thought that it felt like this because she had experienced many wonderful things today. A moment later, she realized something was wrong. She felt a feeling she hadn't felt during the day. She realized that it was death. The young fairy was surprised and wondered if it might be because she had been in darkness for a long time. But a moment later, she realized that she felt a surge of energy. When she was born, she liked the dark. But after meeting the little man, this changed. With the help of a flower that overcame the darkness, she learned the joy of that boy's smile. The young fairy looked into the distance and said to Destruction that she felt her call and heard her enticement. The young fairy said with a smile that she would not fall for it. She did not want to be caught in the net of death as it was at her birth. The young fairy said that she would grow up eating darkness and will illuminate any darkness in this world. She heard the sound of petals scattered in the wind, driving away death. A moment later, the young fairy looked into the distance and said that she had decided on her name. The young fairy smiled and said that from now on her name would be Sharena. Sharena entered the dungeon through the door with the speed of lightning. She looked at the boy with a smile and said that she had returned to him. Sharena looked at the boy and asked if he was bored alone. She said that she brought him a mountain of amazing things. The young boy looked at her with a smile. The fairy smiled and told him to wait a little, and she would give him everything now. The fairy smiled and brought him a strawberry tart, a baguette, and half a piece of cake. The young man looked at everything, puzzled. The fairy laughed a little and said that she had the same face when she first saw a lot of goodies. The young fairy and the boy quietly enjoyed their meal. The young boy looked at the fairy and said that it was very tasty. She looked at him and with a smile told him to eat everything slowly. The young fairy looked at the boy and said with a smile that she saw something else in the market. She said with a smile that she saw a cat. She knew that although this was a Fatara's disguise, it could not be distinguished from the real one. The young man looked at the fairy in puzzlement and surprise. The young fairy looked at him and said with a smile that if he touched him, the disguise would disappear. Since this is an illusion imposed on top, the young fairy looked at him and said with a smile that she had the most important news for him. She said with a smile that she had come up with a name for herself. The young fairy said with a smile that her name is now Sharena. The boy looked at her in surprise. She looked at him and said with a smile that from that day on her name was Sharena. Sharena looked closely at the boy and asked him to repeat her name. The young boy tried to repeat her name. For several minutes the boy tried to pronounce her name. He couldn't do it. But the young fairy did not give up. She pointed out his mistakes several times. The young fairy looked at her friend and said that it must still be difficult for him to pronounce such a name. She looked at him and said that she thought he was doing well, Ren said. The fairy looked at her friend and said that he could call her Ren. The young man looked at her and called her by name with a smile. The young fairy smiled and said that he was great. She learned that it would be very nice if he had his own name. She looked at him closely and confusedly wondered if she would ever be able to find his name. She knew that even if she could find a name for him, she still didn't know if it would make sense in a place like this. The young fairy looked at the boy and asked if she could give him a name. The young man looked at her in surprise, but a moment later he said she could give him a name. The fairy said with a smile that the name is very important. She was surprised that he could give her an answer so easily. The young fairy looked at her friend and said that they could come up with a name together. She would really like to come up with a name that would suit him. The fairy said that she would like to give him a name that had the meaning of hope for divine blessing. She said the name should have 3 syllables of the source. She wondered for a moment if she could come up with a name similar to her. After a few minutes of thought, she said with a smile that she would now call him Riren. The young fairy looked at him and with a smile told him to repeat it. The young man looked at her in surprise and repeated his new name. The young fairy smiled and said that he was her source, so she wanted her name to have 1 syllable from his name. The young fairy smiled and said that he was her Rio and she was his Ren. He looked at her in surprise. A moment later, he said with a smile that she was his Ren. The young fairy was surprised. As her heart began to pound violently, as if her core had broken, she didn't know if there was anything so beautiful in this world. She thought she could never let him go. After the young fairy gave the boy a name, she explored the prison with even greater enthusiasm. The notes she saw in the lab were the only clue. But, unfortunately, beyond this there was nothing useful. She found out that Rio was locked on the 17th floor, but there were also prisoners receiving reinforcements. Ren wanted to make a map to escape from prison, but as soon as she took paper and pencil with her, she would have been caught immediately. She knew she had no choice but to remember everything. Ren decided to go to the control room. The young fairy saw something interesting. She saw a map of the 8th zone. The young fairy realized that the dungeon was a labyrinth. She was not even surprised, since she realized that because of this, she could not find her way. Looking closely at the map, she realized that it was sorting, not by floors, but by zones. She stared at the map for some time and took in all the nuances. She realized that her friend was locked in the 10th zone. Looking at the map, she noticed some strange black circle. She was surprised as no explanation was left. Ren nevertheless decided that there was nothing wrong with this and thought of going to where the black circle was in order to find out everything herself. Heading to her destination, she noticed young people standing near the iron door. Ren was surprised and did not understand what the two people were guarding. But still, she thought that there was something very important behind the door. Ren knew that she definitely needed to get there and see what was behind the door. A moment later, she flew through the door with lightning speed. Ren was a little surprised as she realized that it wasn't even an obstacle. She was determined as she wanted to see what was in such a place. A moment later, the young fairy saw a gate in front of her. The young fairy stared at the gate. She did not know whether it was connected to the labyrinth of destruction, but a moment later, she realized that the sensations were different. The young fairy was surprised and realized that this was most likely the way out. In other words, this place is already a space of destruction. The young fairy noticed that the path was too winding, and the energy spreading everywhere after death proved this. This place is a labyrinth of death. The young fairy wondered what the intentions of the owner of this prison were. Ren knew that it was dangerous for a fairy like her to be in such a place, but she also knew that someday she would get the chance. The young fairy decided at first to use only the stairs to escape. While exploring the labyrinth, she saw the 7th zone. The 7th area was full of people training. There were also people who practiced pistol shooting. Looking at the map of the control room, she found out that there were 3 black gates here. The 5th zone was full of researchers and materials for research. The young fairy looked at everything and wondered if there was anything there about her friend. She knew that if she found something, she could come here often. But still, she knew that she did not have time to rest, since she had to go to the next floor. The 4th area contained food storage and a kitchen. The 3rd zone was where the usual cameras and control rooms began. The lower she went, the more prohibitions and strong prisoners there were. She didn't know what terrible crime her friend had committed, that he ended up locked in the 10th zone, but she still knew that they would be able to use the stairs to escape outside. After a while, she got out. The young fairy wanted to go to the candy store. She wanted to pay the pastry chef for his kindness and learn how to make money. The young fairy flew to the candy store with the speed of lightning. A moment later, she stopped and thought, because she did not remember which way the candy store was located. Flying through the city, the young fairy saw people sitting at a table and talking. She also saw cute children playing happily. She was very happy because she saw that everyone was having fun. She knew that even despite the proximity to the domains of death, people live happy lives. The young fairy passionately wanted Rio to be happy, just like the children. Flying through the middle of the crowd, she saw a musician. A handsome man sat with his eyes closed and played an instrument. The young fairy looked at him as he sang a beautiful song. She was surprised because she heard a beautiful voice. Just by listening to him, she became bolder. Everyone present was delighted with the young man's singing. The young fairy noticed that this person was using a spiritual skill. She was very curious what his eyes were like, since they were hidden behind the blindfold. The young fairy thought that his eyes were definitely as bright as his voice. Ren saw people throwing coins at him. The young fairy was surprised, because she realized that she had to pay too. She was very puzzled and did not know what to do, since she had no money at all. The fairy really liked the song. She decided to give him twice as much money at the next meeting. Ren decided to find out a way to make money. The young fairy gazed at the young man. She felt as if their eyes had met. She was puzzled by this because she knew that if she didn't give her permission, he wouldn't be able to see her. She thought that she had imagined it, and decided to immediately look around and find a bakery. The young man was very happy to meet the fairy, and he greeted her. He said with a smile that he was looking forward to her. The young fairy was surprised, as she did not expect that they would be waiting for her. She looked at the young man and asked in surprise why he was waiting for her. He said that such a small fairy could easily be taken over by destruction, and he was worried that something might happen to her. Ren smiled and told him not to worry, as she was strong and would not succumb to death. She looked at him with a smile and said that she had come up with a name for herself. The young man was surprised and said that now they can introduce themselves to each other. He smiled and said his name was Mamingo Berry, and he is the pastry chef of the Berry Bakery. The young fairy smiled and said that she was a flower fairy, and her name was Sharena. The young man was surprised because he did not expect that she would turn out to be a fairy of flowers. The young man said that the mere birth of a fairy was rare in their domain, and so he was very surprised that she was a fairy of flowers. The young fairy just smiled, and she didn't answer. A moment later, she looked at him and said that she wanted to give him her flower. Mamingo was surprised. He looked at her with a smile and said that it was a great honor for him. The young fairy looked at him and asked if he could extend his hands to her. A moment later, a flower grew on his palms. Mamingo was very surprised because he couldn't even believe that the flower would be so beautiful. The young fairy was very glad that he liked her flower. The young man smiled at her and said that he would go and put it in a vase. He also asked her if she would like something tasty as a return gift. The young fairy was very happy with this proposal. Mamingo brought her a piece of cake and wished her bon appetit. The young fairy attacked the cake with lightning speed. She was very happy because she felt the delicious taste of the cake. The young man looked at her and asked if she liked it. He also said that he had prepared a portion for her friend too, so that she could eat more. The young fairy thanked him with a smile. Mamingo looked at her and said that he really wanted to repay her for the beautiful flower. He also asked if she needed anything else. Ren looked at him and asked if he could tell her more about this place. She knew that in order to help Rio escape, she had to know everything about this world. The young man smiled and said that it was not difficult for him to do this. He also said that first he would need supplies. He showed her the ball and said that this was their planet, and the square picture shows oceans and continents. There are planets in space. They are divided into initial and completed. He said that they are divided by the presence and absence of fairies. He showed her a planet where there is no ruler of the fairies, which is why this planet bears such a name. He also said that the old central continent is an area of origin suitable for human life. The dark part outside is called the domain of death. The young man looked at the fairy and asked if she wanted to look further at the map. He said that at the northernmost point of this continent is the Kavad Empire. The Yulan from the outside is in contact with the darkness. The young man looked at the young fairy and showed on the map where the Uklan was located. The young fairy looked at her companion and asked what kind of castle was drawn on the map. Mamingo said that this was the castle of the ruler of the Lancers. Mamingo said that the castle is known as the worst underground prison in the Ethos Empire. He said that a doom maze was built using it. The worst criminals go there. They can't get out anymore. Ren said that the labyrinth in its death resembles a cancer spreading throughout the area of origin. She looked at it and asked if people could use it. He smiled and confirmed her guesses and said that so far the properties were fine. She looked at him and asked if he knew about the existence of the main destruction, became the core of the labyrinth of death. The young man said that the main death was originally a fairy of the rank of Eula, a fairy who turned into an evil spirit. She was sealed and left in the labyrinth. Ren looked at the map and asked if it turned out that Athos was now under the control of a ruler. Mamingo confirmed her words and said that the current owner of the castle is Duke de Villic Musel. Ren knew that there was a high probability that Rio's master was the Duke. She was very angry because she understood that he was now her enemy. She looked at Mamingo and asked what kind of person was the owner of the castle. The young man looked puzzled at his companion and said that, according to rumors, he was incredibly heartless and cruel. Mamingo said that he is an Enarim-ranked solar. The young lady was shocked by what she heard. As I realized that the Duke is very strong, since his rank is very rare. He was not inferior in strength to Fairy Eula. The young fairy looked at the floor, puzzled, and said that the Duke was definitely very. The young man looked at her, puzzled. Mamingo looked at her and asked if she was planning to commit a crime. The young fairy was shocked by this. She did not expect such a question. A moment later she said, puzzled, that she just wanted to experience the human world. Mamingo smiled and said that if she wants to become a little criminal, then she should increase her strength and earn a lot of money. The young fairy looked at him in surprise. The young man smiled and said that if she had at least one of these listed, she would have a chance of an acquittal. Ren smiled and said that she understood everything. Ren realized that with the help of money, she could free Rio from prison. The young fairy looked at her companion and said that she had decided to earn a lot of money. The young man laughed. He looked at her with a smile and asked how she would do it. Ren said that she wanted to sell flowers and also asked what he thought about this. The young man smiled and said that this was very good, because he was sure that everyone would like the flowers. The young fairy smiled and asked what price she should set in this case. She asked him if she could buy a cheesecake by selling 4 flowers. The young man looked at her, puzzled. Ren looked at his reaction and asked if it was too expensive. She looked at him and said she could sell 6 turns. The young man looked at her and asked if he hadn't said that plants in their area were very rare. She smiled and said that he said that, but still cakes are more expensive. Their conversation was interrupted by a customer. She entered the bakery and greeted Mamingo with a smile. She said she would like to buy a bag of peanut cookies and 1 piece of special cake. Entering the bakery, she immediately noticed a beautiful flower. The young customer was shocked. She gazed at the flower. Later, she asked Mamingo where he got such a beautiful flower. For several minutes, she interrogated the young man where he got such a beautiful flower. The young man, in turn, only smiled. The young man looked at the fairy and said that this lady was his good friend. He looked at the fairy and asked if she could appear to her. She looked at the young man and asked if he would finally tell him where he bought such a flower. A moment later, Ren revealed her true form. The young lady was shocked as she did not expect to see a fairy. The young lady looked at the fairy and asked her name. She also introduced herself by saying that her name was Remy Ingle. Ren looked at the girl and said that she was the flower fairy Sharena, who was born in Ulan. Remy was shocked because she did not expect the flower fairy to be born in Ulan. Remy looked at Ren and asked if she understood correctly that the owner of the flower was Ren. The young fairy smiled and said that everything was true, and this was her gift. The young man smiled and told his friend that the fairy did not yet know what was happening in the world. He smiled and said that the fairy was worried that no matter how many flowers she sold, she still wouldn't earn enough for 1 cheesecake. Remy looked at the fairy and told her to listen carefully, since plants in their region are incredibly expensive. She said flowers, especially endemic species, would sell like hotcakes. Ren was surprised. Ren looked at her new friends and said that to buy Mamingo's cake, she must have had a lot of money. Remy looked at the fairy and asked where she was going to spend the money she earned. Ren said, puzzled, that it was very difficult for her first friend to get out of the Lancers. So she wants to buy good things and share them with him. Remy was surprised, as she knew that newborn fairies usually go on large-scale trips. She gazed at the fairy and wondered how close her friend was to her. Mamingo looked at Ren and said that he was talking to the fairy she met a couple of days ago, and she said that she would come to them soon. Ren was very surprised and happy about this news. Remy looked at Ren and said that she was thinking about something. Ren looked at her, puzzled. Remy said that it was better for the fairy not to tell anyone that she was born into the Lancers. She said that not only were there dangerous people of all kinds, but the owner of the castle herself might come to her. Ren was a little puzzled because she knew that the owner of the castle was the Duke. She looked at her friend and asked why this famous and scary man could come for her. She said that the owner of the castle periodically receives lists of fairies living in the Lancers. He organizes grandiose receptions to which he invites powerful and special fairies. Remy said that since Ren is the fairy of flowers, which was born in the Lancer, then she will definitely receive an invitation from the owner of the tower. Ren was shocked as she realized that this was the man who imprisoned her friend. The young fairy was puzzled because she knew that he had not yet guessed about her. But a moment later, she realized that someone might have seen a flower that grew in prison. She knew she had to be careful after this. Remy looked at her and said with a smile that before her face darkened further, she suggested that she come up with individual characteristics that people could use. The young fairy looked at her friend in surprise. She didn't understand what characteristics she was talking about. Remy looked at the fairy and said that she was a little fairy who came from the south, known as a fairy who sought wealth. And the reason she came to the Lancers is to sell her flowers at high prices. Mamingo looked at them and said that this sounds good. He said that in fact there are many such examples. Ren looked at her friend and said that she really liked the legend. She also said with a smile that Remy is simply a genius. Remy smiled and said it was a piece of cake. Ren smiled looking at Remy and said that if it weren't for her, Ren would have continued to worry alone. Remy squeezed Ren in her arms and asked her how she could be so cute. The young fairy was shocked. Remy said that she wanted to secretly put it in her pocket and take it with her. A fairy came into their bakery and asked who dared to torment her cute little fairy. Daya looked at those present, puzzled and angrily. Daya looked at Remy and told her not to bully little Ison like that. Remy, puzzled, said that she was not mocking, but just being cute. Ren looked at Dayu and said that she had finally come up with a name for herself. The fairy smiled and said that in that case they could introduce themselves to each other. She looked at Ren and said that she was Kranfa, the mineral fairy, and her name was Klundaya. But everyone calls her Daya. Ren smiled and said it was nice to meet you. She said with a smile that she was the fairy of flowers, and her name is Sharena. Daya looked at Ren in surprise. Daya said that the birth of a flower fairy is very rare in their region. She did not understand how a fairy of flowers could be born in a lancer. Ren looked at everyone, puzzled, and said that she was just as shocked as everyone else. The young man looked at the fairies with a smile and said that since they had already finished with the performance, they could sit down and eat something. Daya looked at Ren and asked how about transforming into a human. Daya said that if she lacks energy, she will gladly share hers. Ren looked at the fairy in surprise and thanked her. Daya said that in this case she would be the first to transform. The young fairy looked at her friend in surprise and said that she would also transform. Daya looked at Ren in surprise. She said that at least she didn't expect this. Mamingo and Remy looked at Ren in surprise. They were shocked, because the young fairy in human form was very sweet and beautiful. Mamingo looked at his companions and told them to sit down, and he, in turn, would bring them tea and snacks. Daya looked at Ren and asked if she understood correctly that the young fairy wanted to make money by selling her flowers. Daya asked how many flowers Ren could grow in one day. Ren said she could grow about 15 flowers in one day. Daya asked Ren how she planned to sell them. Ren said she would offer one flower at a time to people at the market. Daya looked at the young fairy puzzled and said that this would not do. Daya told Ren that she didn't realize the value of her flowers. She said that the fairy should try to use the full potential of her flowers. Daya said that you can sell them in the store. Mamingo said that flowers can be sold by the ribbon. Daya looked at the young fairy and asked for forgiveness. She said Ren probably doesn't know who Flora is. Flora is the best florist in Ulan. Her skill in harmoniously weaving flowers is beyond praise. She also ties the ribbon using her soul skill, and the long freshness of flowers is its advantage. The young fairy was shocked. She said that these words alone seemed to show what an incredible person she is. Ren thought that, most likely, she could trust such a person with her flowers. The fairy confirmed Ren's words and said that Flora would be able to better appreciate her flowers. She said that giving her the order before the sale would save Ren time and be more convenient for her. The fairy smiled and said that it was late today, so it was better to go to her tomorrow morning. Remy said with a smile that she might as well come with them. Remy said she could help them and show them the way. Daya looked at the young lady, puzzled, and asked if she wasn't busy with her job as a broker. Remy smiled and said that she was currently studying with her mother, so she would have time. Remy looked at Ren and asked what she thought about 8 in the morning. The young fairy was about the task, but looked at her friend because she didn't know if she could wake up on time. Remy said you could just set the alarm. The young fairy said, puzzled, that her friend had some circumstances, because he is locked in a dark room where sunlight does not reach, and personal belongings are also prohibited there. Those things are like an alarm clock because they will make noise. Ren said she was telling this information to the 3 of them because she felt she could trust each of them. The young people looked at her closely and were surprised, but they were also pleased that she trusted them. Remy said she didn't know that. She looked at the fairy puzzled and said that she could come as soon as she woke up. Remy looked at the fairy and asked if she needed anything else. She said that if she needed any information, Ren could easily contact her at any time. Ren looked at everyone present and asked if they had a book with which you can learn to write and read. Remy said she could borrow it from the library, but that's a problem right now, since a library registration and membership card is required. Daya looked at Ren and asked if she understood correctly that Ren did not want to be noticed by the owner of the castle. She said they should add characterization to her setting. The young fairy looked at Daya in surprise. Daya said that Ren came to earn money and met her. Daya is a fairy who protects the guild of artisans who earn the most money in this empire. Daya said that after listening to Ren, she brought her to Ulan to sell flowers. Daya said that with such a story, even the head of the castle would not be interested in her. She said that the head of the castle only interacts with battle fairies of the rank of Bakalas and above. The young fairy thanked her new friend. Mamingo looked at Ren and asked how he should care for her flower, since he wanted to admire it for a long time. Ren looked at the young man and told him to simply take care of the flower, like other plants. At least her flowers possessed in their sleep, driving away death. She knew she would have to wait a bit to see how it would work. He looked at Ren and said that she was a little fairy and didn't know much about her flowers, because he really wanted to know how to care for them so that the flowers would last a little longer. The young fairy looked at the young man and asked how about growing a flower for him every time she came. The young man was surprised. The young fairy smiled and said that he was still kind to her from the very first time they met. She knew that if she became friends with the young man, she might ask for cake again. She really hoped that the young man would someday be able to teach her baking so that she could please her friend in the future. The young fairy is very helpful to her new friends. Mamingo smiled and thanked her. He said with a smile that he would be very grateful to her. They sat in silence for some time and drank tea. Remy burst into the bakery, and with a smile, she said that she had returned. Daya looked at Remy and said that she returned quickly, and also asked what she brought. Remy said with a smile that she had brought a language workbook that she used to write in as a child. Remy said that the loan period at the library was limited, but since it was her thing, Ren could study without worrying about time. The young fairy looked at her friends and thanked them for all the kindness they had shown her. Remy smiled and said that she was very embarrassed when Ren spoke with tears in her eyes. Daya looked at Remy and Sharena and said with a smile that they were very similar to each other. Daya looked at the young beauties and asked how about tying each other into an agency agreement. The fairy said that she was talking about an agent and that she meant an exclusive broker. He acts as an intermediary, helping to meet with whomever the customer wishes and helps with any matter. The fairy looked at the young lady and said that although Remy looks like a fool, she is very capable. She said that Remy is the daughter of Soap, the best broker in the empire, and through Remy, the young fairy can achieve anything. The young fairy was delighted with such news. She really liked this proposal. A moment later, the young fairy said that she really liked the offer, but she had nothing to offer Remy for the contract. Remy looked at the young fairy and said that she would make a contract with her if she would give her one flower each time. Ren was surprised at the price. Remy looked at her and said that her flowers were worth it. She said that she knew this for sure, despite the fact that she was completely new to brokerage. Remy smiled and said that for now she was learning from her mother, so she asked the young fairy to be understanding with her if she was a little clumsy. She said with a smile that this would also be her first agency agreement. Remy looked at the young fairy and said that she would work hard. The young fairy gazed at the young lady and felt her indomitable ardor. Ren looked at her friend and said that in that case she would be glad to make an agreement with her. Remy smiled and said that in that case they would make an agreement here tomorrow. She also told the fairy not to worry, as she would bring all the necessary papers. Daya looked at Ren and said that she already has a very busy schedule tomorrow, since she needs to conclude the first contract and organize the sale of flowers. The young fairy looked at her friend and said that she was looking forward to this moment. Mamingo looked at the young fairy and called her. The young man looked at Ren and asked if she would mind if she also concluded a contract with him. He said with a smile that, like Remy, one flower would be enough for him as a reward. Mamingo said that in return, he would only allow her to eat as much bread as she wanted from the bakery. The young fairy was delighted with this proposal. Ren looked at the young man and said that this was a very pleasant condition for her. Mamingo looked at her and said with a smile that it was also very beneficial for him. He looked at her and said with a smile that, just like Remy said before, the fairy flowers are worth it. After all, this is the only species in the world. Mamingo looked intently at the young fairy and said that he really liked her flowers. He also said that he really liked how she happily eats his cooked bread. The young fairy was in seventh heaven. She said with a smile that she would definitely conclude an agreement with him. The young man, in turn, was also very happy. He looked at her and said that in that case he would give her his business card. Ren took the business card and was a little surprised as she saw the owner's name. Mamingo said that the owners are a fairy, who is also Daya's close friend, but she's on a short trip right now, so she's away for now. Daya looked at the young fairy and said that it would work out tomorrow. She enters into 2 contracts at once. She said with a smile that it would be nice to go and get ready for tomorrow. Mamingo looked at her and asked if she would choose the bread to share with her friend. The young fairy was looking forward to this moment. Ren brought her friend a lot of tasty things. Ren looked at Rio and said that all the food must be very tasty since she got everything from the bakery. Ren said with a smile that she could come there even more often in the future. The young fairy enjoyed the delicious meal. She was very happy. The young fairy said with a smile that since they were both full, they could start studying. Ren showed her friend a language learning workbook. She looked at him and said that they should first start with consonants and vowels. The young fairy gradually began to teach her friend. The young people gradually studied the workbook and all the information that was there. The young fairy was very glad that everything worked out for her friend. Ren wanted to show Rio how to write letters and how to hold a pencil correctly. The fairy looked puzzled at the notebook and at the way she held the pencil. Ren smiled and said that she herself should learn to hold a pencil. She smiled and suggested that her friend only read today. Rio smiled and agreed with her. For some time, they still studied letters and words. The young fairy smiled and said that they had to finish for today. She also said that her transformation is coming to an end. The young fairy smiled and said that she wanted to show him something new. Ren showed her friend the bakery's business card. She said with a smile that she gets them bread from this place. She also read what was written on the business card. Ren looked at Rio and said that she met good people in this place today. Ren said they would vouch for her personality and provide her with treats and things she wanted. The young fairy smiled and said that they were very good people, and someday she would definitely introduce Rio to them. Ren flew closer to her friend and said that tomorrow she was going to make a contract. Rio looked at her and tried to say the word contract. The young fairy looked at her friend and said with a smile that she had achieved a lot today. She also told him to praise her. Rio looked at her in surprise. The young fairy looked at him and told him to stroke her head with his finger. Rio immediately did as she asked. Ren smiled and thanked him. She said it gives her strength. Ren smiled and said that although he doesn't understand a lot, she will try for him. The young fairy smiled and said that she wanted to show him the whole world and feed him a lot of things. Rio looked at her in surprise. A moment later, he stroked her head again. The young fairy was very happy. She looked at him and told him to say that she was great, since she managed completely. He looked at her and said with a smile that she was great, and he also said that she would absolutely cope. The young fairy looked at him and said that she thought it was time for her to go to bed. Rio came closer to her. Ren looked at her friend and said that she had used up all her energy today, so she wanted to go to bed early. The young fairy looked at her friend and wished him good night. Rio looked at the sleeping fairy and wished her good night as well. Moments later, they both fell asleep. The next day, a lot of people came to the bakery. One of the visitors really admired the delicious cakes. Mamingo smiled and apologized for the long wait. He also said with a smile that he would now help with the calculations. The man smiled and said everything was fine, since they have a lot of visitors this morning, and he understands everything. The young man smiled and said that, to tell the truth, he thought it was all thanks to the flower. Those present saw a beautiful flower. They were shocked and did not understand where the young man was able to get such a beautiful flower. The man came closer to the flower and asked the pastry chef where they bought such a lovely flower, since he said that he also wanted to buy the same one. The young man smiled and said that he himself would have liked to tell them, but the flower accidentally fell into his hands. He smiled and said that he didn't know for sure, but he thought that such flowers would soon be sold in Flora's store. The young man was a little puzzled, as he was very tired. The young man looked at the young fairy and asked how she felt about the secret observation. The young fairy smiled and said that she was very interested. She smiled and said that his bread was very popular. The young man thanked her and said that it was all thanks to her flower. He looked at her and asked if she had seen that everyone was asking where they could buy such a flower. He also said that everyone vehemently praised the flower for its wonderful beauty. Mamingo looked at her and said that he had said earlier that people in their region loved flowers very much. He said that because of the dark death, as soon as the sun sets beyond the horizon, pitch darkness sets in. Even knowing that they will soon wither, people leave plants at home. Plants also absorb death. The young fairy was surprised, as she realized that her flowers were capable of absorbing death. She was glad that she was born here as a fairy of flowers. Some time later, Remy came to their bakery. She greeted the young people with a smile. The young fairy was very glad that her new friend came. Ren hurried over to Remy and said with a smile that she had been looking forward to her. Remy was very happy. Remy looked at the fairy and said that she had brought a contract with her. Remy looked at Mamingo and Ren and asked them to read the contract. The young fairy was very surprised and interested, since it was the first time she had seen the contract. The young man looked at the contract and said that he did not think that there was a need for correction. He asked if it was possible to put a stamp on it already. Remy said that they will put the stamp a little later since she's going to go to some places, that it's better to get together later and put a stamp on it. He said that in that case, he would prepare for the sale in the afternoon and asked them to take the cookies. He looked at Remy and asked her to take the cookies to the flora. The young lady smiled and asked if he wanted to harness her to deliver. He smiled and said that he would not remain in debt. The young lady smiled and said that in that case she would take them right away. Remy looked at the fairy and invited her to quickly go solve all the problems. The young fairy smiled and agreed with her. The fairy and Remy quietly left the bakery and went about their business. Remy told the fairy that she needed to make a seal first before going to the flora. The young fairy was surprised because she did not know what a seal was. Remy said that the contract requires a special seal. This is the Continuum seal, which is made from minerals, and this mineral, which was personally created by the fairy ruler. Remy said that if a contract is violated or terminated unilaterally, the contractor receives a mineral curse and cannot create new contracts for a long time. She said that printing is a way to ensure reliability. The young fairy looked at her friend puzzled and asked if it was okay if she had no money. Remy told the young fairy not to worry, as she would be able to pay for the seal. Remy also said that to do this, the young fairy needs to take a photo to receive a registration card. The young fairy smiled and said that it looked like she would be busy all day today. Remy looked at the fairy with a smile and told her not to worry, as they would do everything together. The man prepared the camera for the photo. He looked at the young lady and asked her to smile naturally. The young fairy immediately followed his advice. The man looked at her and said that everything was very good, and he would take a photo of her soon. Ren looked at her companion with a puzzled expression and said that this was the first time she had done many things in one day. Remy smiled and said that they had already bought a stamp and took a photo. So next, you need to go to meet the flora. The young fairy looked at her companion and asked what kind of person Flora was. Remy thought for a moment. Remy said that the young lady became a florist who opened her own shop 5 years ago. Now she is only 17 years old, but she has already achieved great success. Ren was puzzled because she didn't know if her flowers could please the flora. Remy looked at the fairy and asked how many flowers she could grow. The young fairy said that in order to grow all flowers, conditions must be met. During promotion, she must again select the flower's attribute. She said that you need to be a huge professional and try hard. Remy smiled and said that even her mother, the broker, does not often see such fairies. The young fairy realized that Remy's mother was an amazing person. She looked at her companion in surprise and asked if her mother was dating top-level fairies. The young lady said that her mother was called the best spiritual contract broker in the empire. She said that she dreams of one day surpassing her. Remy smiled and asked the fairy to continue to keep an eye on her. The young fairy smiled and said that she would certainly do so, and also asked her companion to also keep an eye on her. Remy looked at the fairy and said that it seems they didn't follow the interesting conversation before they arrived at the place. The young lady and the fairy gazed at the florist's flower shop. Remy entered the store and greeted Flora. Flora stood in her turn and closely watched the flowers. The young lady saw Remy and greeted her with a smile. Flora looked at Remy and asked if she had come to order flowers. Remy smiled and said that she came today for mediation. Flora was surprised. She looked at her friend and asked if she had entered into an agreement with the florist. Remy looked at her and said that she had made a contract not with the florist, but with the fairy. Flora was a little surprised. Remy looked at the fairy and asked if she could give permission for the flora to see her. The young fairy smiled. You looked at the flora and said that she wanted to introduce her to the fairy who came to the store to sell flowers. The young fairy appeared in all her glory and greeted the flora. She also said that she was very glad to meet her. Flora was very surprised. She said that she did not think that she would see such a young fairy on Yulon Street. Flora looked at the fairy and asked if she was born from a magic drop that recently fell from the sky. The young fairy smiled and said that it was so. The young fairy decided to pull herself together because she knew that a legend had already been invented for her. She said that she followed the fairy Daya and came here to earn money. She smiled and told the Flora that if she came to her, she could sell her flowers. Wren looked at Flora and asked if she could offer her her hand. The fairy said that she would like to give her a flower as a sign of her request to take care of her. For some time, Flora closely watched the fairy as she worked her magic. Flora was very surprised, as she had never seen anything like this before. In an instant, a flower appeared in her palm. Flora was very surprised, as she realized that this was the same flower that visitors had recently been looking for. Flora smiled and said that today, a crowd of visitors came to her store and asked questions about where to get such a flower. She said that she was very curious about what kind of flower they were looking for, but now she understood everything. She said that this is a flower that, just looking at it, warms the heart. She said the color of the petals is soft but bright, and the sheets, in turn, are round and voluminous. She said he has a charm that attracts people's attention. Remy looked at the Flora and said that it seemed like her score was very high. Flora smiled and said that anyone would say that when looking at such a beautiful flower. Flora looked at the fairy and thanked her for coming to her. She said that she would sell her flowers and also asked how many she could grow in a day. The fairy smiled and said that now she is able to raise about 15. Flora smiled and said that they would do the following. She said that the purchase price of one flower would be 100,000 pitas. She said that she would sell at that price now, but soon she thought that she could raise the price to 1,000,000 pitas. The young fairy was very happy, but also a little puzzled, since she did not know how much money it was. Because I haven't figured it out yet. Remy looked at the fairy and said that this was a very high price, since one piece of cake cost 10,000 pitas. The young fairy was very surprised and happy, as she realized that she could buy 10 pieces of cake for one flower. I thought I was in a dream now. She thought that this was most likely a dream, and she needed to wake up quickly. Flora looked at the fairy and asked if she would deal exclusively with her. She said she wanted to study her flowers inside and out. The young fairy, puzzled, said that this is very good, but unfortunately, she will not be able to come often, since she cannot freely leave the place where she lives. Flora looked at her and asked how about using communications. She said that the fairy could be used by him on the day when she could not come. Remy looked at the fairy and said that was a good idea. She asked the fairy if she wanted to buy a communicator now. The fairy smiled and said that she wanted to. The young people discussed all the details of the contract and agreed on the terms. Remy said they needed to sign a contract at the bakery. Flora agreed to the terms, and they agreed to meet sometime later at the bakery. The young fairy looked at her companion and asked where they were going now. Rami said that they were going to the castle administration because they needed to make a registration card. Rami said that when a fairy submits an application, she enters the name, level, attribute, origin, and declares the guarantor of her residence. Remy said that she would be the guarantor for her stay. The first thing to do was to complete the paperwork as a human. The second is a demonstration of abilities. The young fairy needed to directly demonstrate her abilities. The young man was surprised because he saw a flower in my palm. He was amazed by the beauty of the flower. The young fairy was a little puzzled as she saw the expression on the young man's face. She didn't understand why he was just silent and didn't say anything. Remy looked at the young man and asked for forgiveness, and also asked if he could quickly fill out the document. The young man hurriedly asked for forgiveness and said that he would do everything immediately. Remy looked at the fairy and said that she seemed to have impressed everyone. She also said with a smile that from the very moment she turned into a human, no one could take their eyes off Ren. Remy looked at the fairy and asked if she could feel people's gazes. The young fairy, embarrassed and puzzled, said that she now understood everything, because before she thought that she had done something wrong. Remy said that, to be honest, there weren't many children in their region, so everyone was watching Ren closely. The young man provided Ren with a registration card. He told her to use it whenever she needed to confirm her identity. The young fairy was very happy. This was the first time she had seen the registration card. Rami smiled and said that now she can get a library card at the library. Remy smiled and told the fairy that if she needed her help in the future, she could contact her at any time. My fairy smiled and thanked her companion. After some time, the fairy accepted Remy's help and made a library card at the library. Later, they went to a store and bought a communicator. First, she exchanged numbers with Remy. The minxes were very happy and had fun. They didn't even notice that the time had come to sign the contract. The young fairy met with her friends to sign contracts. Remy looked at the fairy and said that all that was left was to sign and stamp. The young fairy smiled and said that she was putting a seal. Remy looked at the contract and said that she was now making it official. Remy looked at Mamingo with a smile. He in turn also smiled. Remy smiled and said that they were now contract workers. The young fairy smiled and said that the contract was very exciting, and she in turn was very excited. The young people thanked the fairy, and they said that they were very happy to sign a contract with her. Flora looked at the young fairy and said that a contract with a flower fairy was indeed rare. Mamingo looked at them and said that since they signed the contract, she could take as much bread as she wanted. The young fairy was very happy and thanked the young man with a smile. Remy looked at Flora and asked if it seemed to her that her mother had become a completely different person. Flora, in turn, smiled and said that it was so. Remy looked at Flora and asked when he was going to reveal his true identity to the young fairy. The young fairy smiled and told everything to her friend. She said that she went through it all in human form. She smiled and asked what he thought. She also asked if she did a good job. The fairy saw a face that expressed complete misunderstanding. Rio looked at the young fairy intently and in surprise. Ren looked at him and asked why he was looking at her in such surprise. A moment later, he rose to his feet. The young fairy was surprised, and she called him by name. Ren looked at him and asked what happened. She looked at him in surprise and asked if something bad had happened. Rio came closer to her and asked who did this. The fairy was at a loss. The young man looked at her face and asked again who did it. The young fairy looked at him with indignation. The young man calmly and affectionately stroked her face with his hand. Rio looked at her intently and asked if it hurt. Rio kept asking who did this to her face. The young fairy smiled and said that she did it herself. Ren said that she was just very happy because her flowers would be sold at a very high price. The young fairy smiled and said she hit herself lightly. She smiled and told him not to worry about it. Rio was puzzled as he knew she was in pain. The young fairy smiled. She was pleased with his concern. She looked at him and said that she promised him that if anyone hurt her, she would definitely tell him. She smiled and said that she knew he was worried about her, and she asked him not to worry about her. The young man agreed with her. The young fairy smiled and asked if it turned out that he was no longer worried. Ren smiled and said that since she was in human form, they needed to practice writing letters. A moment later, she took out all the necessary supplies. The young fairy smiled and said that they needed to start with the pencil-holding technique. The fairy smiled and said that when concluding contracts today, she had to write her name many times. The young fairy looked at her friend, and she showed him how to hold a pencil correctly. A moment later, the fairy showed her friend how to spell her name correctly. The young fairy smiled and wrote her name and her friend. Ren looked at Rio and asked if he wanted to try writing the name. The young fairy was surprised because Rio took the pencil correctly in his hand the first time. She smiled and said she wanted to see if he could spell the name correctly the first time. The young fairy watched her friend closely. After a few minutes, she looked at his notes in surprise. Ren looked at him in surprise and said that he was doing very well. She was puzzled as he only wrote her name. Ren looked at him and asked if he liked her name. Rio smiled and said that he really liked her name. The young fairy smiled and asked him to write down his name as well. The young man agreed and began writing. The young fairy was very happy. She was happy that she was able to teach her friend. She looked at him and praised him with a smile. The fairy came closer to him and hugged him. She told Rio that in that case, they could now read a book of fairy tales taken from the library and go to bed later. The young fairy was lying on her back and reading a book to her friend. Ren was reading the book continuously. She was very happy and having fun. The young fairy enjoyed reading. After a few minutes of reading, Ren looked sideways at her friend and said that he was just as amazing as the chick in the book. Rio looked at her in surprise. The young fairy smiled and said that it seemed like he was only looking at her again. Ren looked at him and said with a smile that he was probably thinking about something else. She smiled and asked what he was thinking about. Rio looked at her, puzzled, and said that he was thinking about the contract. The young fairy looked at him and asked if he was interested in what a contract was. Ren said that the contract is a promise from each of the two beings, namely, to give each other what is valuable. She said that Mamingo promised to give his food, Remy the necessary things, and Flora money. Ran said that in return, she promised to grow her own flowers for them. The young fairy looked at her friend and said that this was very surprising, since her flowers had a high price. Ren looked at Rio and asked what he thought about this. The young fairy looked at her friend and asked him if her flowers were important to him. Ren looked at him and said that she could give him one of her flowers. The fairy asked her friend what he could give her in return. The young man looked at her intently and said his name. She looked at him in surprise. He said that he would give himself to her. The young fairy was shocked, as she did not expect this from him. The young fairy looked at her friend and said with a smile that he was embarrassing her, and she also said that it was much more valuable than her flowers. The young man moved closer to her and said that she was valuable, and he wanted to conclude a contract with her. The young fairy was very embarrassed, and it seemed to her that her core was about to explode. It seemed to her that today was indeed a strange day. For her, today seemed like a dream that never ends. She thought she was really asleep. The young fairy looked at her friend and asked what kind of contract he wanted to conclude with her. Rio looked at her and said that he wanted to make a soul contract with her. The young fairy was puzzled and surprised by this statement. She looked closely at Rio and said that the soul contract is not at all easy. Ren said that a soul contract is a seal of each other's existence. If a person opens the door of the Solim soul, he will become a solar who can use the power of the fairy. The souls of a person and a fairy will become connected, and the person will become the solar of only this fairy. The young fairy looked closely at his friend and asked if he wanted to make a contract with her, even though she doesn't have as much power as the others. Rio looked at her and said that he wanted to make a contract with her, and he also asked her to make a soul contract with him with a smile. The young fairy was surprised and embarrassed. Rio smiled and took her hand. He looked at her intently and asked her to stay with him forever. Rio repeated to her several times that he wanted her to be tired of him forever. Ren was surprised and embarrassed, as she did not expect such words from him. The young fairy pushed her friend away, and in a trembling voice said that it wouldn't work out now. The young man was surprised. The young fairy told her friend that she refused to enter into a contract with him, not because she hated him. She said it was a choice she made for him. A person who has entered into a contract with a fairy will have a fairy mark on their body. She said he is examined every day, and in such a situation it will be impossible to hide the fairy mark. She said that from the note, he may face even more difficulties than now. The young fairy smiled tenderly and said that she did not want to expose him to such danger. The young fairy smiled and said that she would promise him something instead. She said with a smile that he would be her first soul contractor. The young man looked at her in surprise. Ren said that since she is small, it is too difficult for her to enter into a soul contract yet. But when he gets out and she becomes an adult, then the time will be right. The young fairy smiled and said that until then, she would not enter into a soul contract with anyone. Therefore, he should wait a little. The young man smiled and said that he would wait for her. The young fairy came closer to him and thanked him. The young fairy greeted Mamingo and Remy with a smile. She was very happy and told them that she had already arrived. The young man looked at the young fairy and greeted her with a smile. Remy, in turn, also greeted the young fairy with a smile. Remy looked at her friend and invited her to the table to eat the cake with her. The young fairy smiled and thanked Remy. The young man looked at the fairy and asked if she came today for the sake of photographs. The fairy smiled and said that taking photographs was very interesting. Ren looked at the young people and said that she really liked showing her friend what she saw. She also said that she wanted to ask them something. The young people sat in bewilderment and looked at the fairy. The fairy said, puzzled, that to tell the truth, she had told her friend a lot about them, but did not know how to properly introduce them to him. Ren looked at them and asked if she could call them her friends. Remy, in turn, was very surprised. She thought the fairy was very cute and wanted to immediately take her with her. Mamingo smiled and said that, of course, it is possible. Remy, in turn, was very happy and also said that, of course, you can call her your friend. The young fairy was very happy. Ren looked at them confused. She realized that they had been friends before. The young fairy looked at the young people and asked, since they were already friends, if they could address each other as you. The young people agreed with her with a smile. The young fairy thanked the young people with joy. She also asked them with a smile to take care of her. Remy slammed her fist on the table in emotion. The young lady was shocked and didn't understand how someone could be such a cute fairy. Mamingo smiled and said that if she broke the table, she would pay for it herself. Remy looked at the young man and said that he was also crazy about the young fairy. She didn't understand why he pretended to be so calm. The young man, puzzled, asked her why she continued to accuse him. Remy looked at him and said it was because he didn't even like flowers. The young man looked closely at the flower and said that everything was true, and he never liked flowers. But the flower of the young fairy is special. Mamingo said that the fairy is sincere and cheerful, and so her flowers remind him of this. Remy smiled and said that this made her flowers look even more beautiful. Mamingo thought it might have something to do with her extra attribute. The fairy attribute is divided into main and additional. For example, the wren flower represents her main attribute, and the fairy's character and degree of sympathy are determined by an additional attribute. But still, the young man knew that the young fairy looked cute to her because of this attribute. He thought that there was no connection with the attribute originally. It was very sad that the recently born fairy was suffering a lot and was trying for the sake of her friend. The young fairy reminded Mamingo of someone. The young man thought that if such a child existed, he might have felt the same. Remy looked at the young man and said that she thought that the fairy's friend was a prisoner locked on the upper floors of the tower. Mamingo said it was so, because the young fairy was asking about the owner of the castle. Mamingo said that if you listened to her words, he was definitely locked in solitary confinement. He said that the fairy accidentally became friends with a serious criminal in such a place. Remy, puzzled, said that she had heard that this was not a place for people to live. She looked at the young man and asked what he thought about it, because he knew about it better than anyone else. She looked at him and said he was a criminal with 8 previous convictions. The young man instantly changed his face and said that the place looked like a dump. The young lady smiled and said that everything was correct, as he had told her when that the bread there was not tasty. The young man said that because of this shock, he started baking cookies. Remy looked at him and asked, puzzled, which guys were mostly in solitary confinement. Mamingo said that usually very dangerous criminals are locked up there, but strong ones are also locked up solars. The young lady, puzzled, said that it would be nice if this prisoner were at least a little kind. The young man looked sideways at the young lady and said that if she was done with her business, then he would like to close the bakery. Remy looked at him in surprise and asked where he was going to go. She asked if he was heading to the field of destruction again. The young man, with a gloomy expression, said that he was heading to the field of destruction. He looked at the young lady and said that he was going to kill all night long. The young man, puzzled, called to his friend and told him to look in the other direction. They saw Solar Heptarim Mamingo Berry. He was a solar rank 7 out of 10. The young people whispered furiously. They were shocked because they knew that he was one of the few who could reach the front line. The young man moved his friend, puzzled, and said that he did not care, and also told him to get out of the way. He came closer to Mamingo and greeted him, calling him an old acquaintance. The young man looked at Mamingo puzzled and said that he had no idea whether famous people like him remembered. The young man looked at Mamingo and said that recently, very interesting rumors had begun to circulate about him. He said that he had recently heard that a young flower fairy had recently appeared. The young man said with a grin that he heard that Mamingo seduced her and entered into a contract with her. The young man looked at the young man and said with a grin that she seemed to have good talents. He also asked if Mamingo wanted to tell them a few secrets. The young man said with a grin that he also wanted to seduce the naive fairy and conclude a contract with her. In the blink of an eye, a weapon froze at the young man's throat. Mamingo came closer to the young man and said that he had better watch his mouth carefully. He glared at the young man and said that he needed to watch his words if he did not want to die at his hands. Mamingo looked angrily at the young man and asked who seduced whom. Everyone looked intently at the young people. They did not understand what the young man was doing. Mamingo said that he was so angry. Mamingo looked at the young man and said that he was very obvious, which was even funny. He looked at him intently and asked if he thought that he did not understand that the young man was using her as an excuse just to start a fight. Mamingo looked at the young man and asked if his stupid head was heavy, because he can take it off his shoulders in a second. The young man was terrified, approached Mom and asked him to calm down and not waste his energy. He smiled and said that it would be better for them to hunt in this place. A moment later, Mamingo took back his weapon. He looked at the young man with contempt and said that he should be more careful not to catch his eye. Finally, Mamingo looked sideways at the young man and said that if he saw him again, he would really kill him. For some time, the young man trembled with fear. The young man, in turn, patted Mamingo on the shoulder, and he said that they needed to quickly go to the battlefield. The young man was glad that he dissuaded Mamingo from the crime, but he also knew that Mamingo's temperament was very bad, but he knew he had to tolerate his temper. Mamingo Berry was an experienced and skilled hunter, which was superior in strength and capabilities to most hunters. On the battlefield in Mamingo, he met bloodthirsty monsters. Mamingo attacked with lightning speed and dealt heavy blows to the monsters. Everyone was shocked, as Mamingo dealt with the huge Capitum with just one blow. The fights on the field are similar in terms of death. The battle is to exterminate and destroy a monster that reproduces endlessly, until the real destruction that is the core is found. The longer the battle with the Bane, the more dangerous the corrupted blight becomes. Hunters with a weak self may be consumed by destruction. Hunters from the front line, who directly face the Capitum, are at much greater risk than others. Because of this, they are very sensitive to managing their self, and their management methods are varied, but at the same time simple. Have plants nearby that absorb death, or have a hobby to which you dedicate yourself entirely, or think about someone who calms the mind and soul. After a protracted battle, Mamingo sat on the ground and smiled silently. The young man sincerely wanted tomorrow to come quickly. Mamingo smiled and greeted the young fairy. He brought her the cake she asked for last time. The young fairy smiled and sincerely thanked him. The young man smiled and asked why she decided to decorate the cake herself. The young fairy smiled. The young fairy said that her friend had finished learning the language. Mamingo was shocked. He said that this was excellent news, and the young man coped with it very quickly. The young fairy smiled and said that this was truly amazing. They studied one book every day. The young fairy smiled and said that that's why she wanted to give her friend a cake as a congratulation. She also said that she would like to put an inscription on top. The young man smiled and said that she must really like her friend. The young fairy said that she wrote his name in chocolate and decorated the edges with her own. The young fairy wrote on the cake that she congratulated her friend and was very proud of him. She was very happy and told her friends with a smile that she had finished the cake. Flora looked at her and said that they needed to pack the cake. The young fairy smiled and said that she would do so immediately. Some time later, the young fairy smiled and said that she had finished packing the cake into the box. Flora looked at the young fairy and said that she thought she had dressed up because it was a special day. Flora said with a smile that compared to the everyday look, "This one is even cuter." The young fairy was surprised and asked if it was true. She said that her friends should like it too. Flora looked at the fairy and with a smile told her to convey her congratulations to her friend for his success in his studies. Mamingo said he hoped the cake would be to his liking. Ren smiled and said that she would definitely pass it on. The young fairy hugged Flora and thanked them. Mamingo smiled and said that he thought her friend was already waiting for her. He smiled and told her to come to him quickly. The young fairy smiled and said goodbye to them. Ren was very happy and immediately flew to meet her friend. Mamingo looked at the Flora and asked how the flowers were sold by the young fairy. Flora smiled and said that she had raised the price. She said that the flowers are so popular that they are all sold out. The young man smiled and said that in this case, the fairy no longer had to worry about money. Flora told him not to worry, since the fairy had already earned a lot of money. Flora said that at this rate, she would soon make a fortune. Flora was a little puzzled, as she was worried that very soon the young fairy would be noticed by the owner of the castle himself. The young fairy presented her friend with a cake and congratulated him on completing his studies. The young man looked at the cake in surprise. He asked if it was true that she made the cake for him. The young fairy smiled and said that everything was right, and this cake was her gift for him. The young fairy looked at her friend and asked if he remembered how it was in the book. She said that the bear blew out the candles on the cake. Ren smiled and said they could do the same. The young man looked intently at the gift the fairy gave him. He looked at her and said that he was very happy, and his mood was very good. The young fairy was very happy. She looked at him and asked if he would like to blow out the candles then. Ren said they needed to be blown out before they melted. She was a little puzzled because she noticed that they had already begun to melt. She was shocked because she realized that it would be spoiled. Rio grabbed the candles in his hands. The young fairy was shocked and screamed for him to open his palms. The young fairy told him to give her his palm. She was shocked and did not understand why he grabbed the hot candles. The young fairy was puzzled as she noticed that Rio had been burned by fire. She looked at him and asked what found him. The young man said that it would hurt her, since the candle flame is hot and dangerous, and it would have hurt if Ren had grabbed the candle. Rio looked at the young fairy and said that Ren was dear to him and he wouldn't want her to get hurt. Ren stared at the cake. She was shocked as she didn't expect Rio to say something like that. She realized that he just wanted to protect her. The young fairy looked at her friend and asked him not to do this in the future. She looked at him intently and said sadly that it hurt her to see him suffer. The young man looked at her intently and asked if he had hurt her. Ren looked at him and he was a task, but said that she meant something else. She was shocked because she realized that he had misunderstood her. The young fairy hugged her friend tightly and asked him to appreciate himself more. She smiled and said that first he needed to be treated. A moment later, the young fairy used her magic and healed him. The young fairy gazed at her friend. She wanted him to quickly understand that he was locked in such a place temporarily. She knew that he was a precious seed that could not be replaced by anything else. As the fairy of flowers, she had a responsibility and wanted to make sure it sprouted. The young fairy was a little surprised, since she did not expect his wounds to heal so quickly. The young fairy was surprised as she used her abilities, but what surprised her was that his wounds were healing very quickly. The young fairy was briefly distracted from her thoughts when she saw Rio eating the cake. She was surprised. She asked him what he was doing. Rio looked at her puzzled and said that he had the cake that she had prepared for him. The fairy said that you can't eat food from the floor. The young man leveled up and said that her cake was very tasty. The man looked closely at the boy. A moment later, he said with a grin that the mind correction was complete. The woman looked at the boy and said that all that was left was to weaken him. "Since I am completely depressed." The man looked at his mentor and asked if the training would really start next month. The man looked intently at those present and said that everything was correct and that it would be necessary to report this to the boss. The man looked at the boy with a grin and said that, in the end, his inner self was crushed. He considered the boy a stupid rebel. The young fairy made faces. She said with a grin that they themselves were stupid. The young fairy looked at them and said that her Rio had fooled them all. The young fairy flew up to Rio and whispered in his ear that she would follow the explorers today. She said that they would see each other in the room a little later. The young fairy smiled and said that they would see each other soon. A moment later, she flew after the people. Ren followed the people continuously. Ren knew that, according to those people, they took the elevator and immediately arrived in the 4th area. She knew she needed to remember everything. The researchers who arrived in the 4th zone began a conversation over a meal that was completely unbecoming for them. The young fairy noticed that the portion of food given to Rio was completely different. She noticed that the researchers ate fresh food and drank warm coffee. The young fairy was shocked and could not believe that these people were torturing Rio, because their conversations were simple, which made it even more terrifying. The young fairy was shocked and very angry as they sat and ate while Rio was locked up. The young fairy sat intently and watched everyone. She realized that the bespectacled researcher was in charge. She knew that if she could follow him, she would find out something about Rio. Following the man, she came to the 2nd floor of the castle. He texted Dominique Grayson and headed to his personal laboratory. The man was surprised as he noticed that he had received information about the regents that he asked Noel for. He looked at the documents and said that the development of lycodium had finally been completed. The young fairy read in the notes that the drug makes the skin stronger and bulletproof. She was surprised and did not understand at what meeting they were going to use it. The young fairy saw additional entries. She decided to immediately study them as she realized that there was information about her friend there. She was shocked because she read that out of the 20 people who survived, the numbers were 6, 11, 14, and 20. For these children, the values are numbered 1, 2, 3, 4 in age order. Their procedural logs have also been renamed. The young fairy was shocked because she realized that besides Rio, there were other children who had been subjected to cruel experiments. She was at a loss and did not understand how the other children survived. She desperately wanted to know what happened to them. The answers to these questions were freely available on the next table. The purpose of this experiment was to create a creature whose abilities would surpass those of humans. All the children who participated in this experiment, except Rio, died a long time ago. In addition, over the past 7 years, Rio has been exposed to a strong toxic dose of drugs that cause various side effects. The young fairy now understood why the young man had superhuman abilities, which Rio showed. He had powerful regenerative abilities, and this was also the result of the drug. The young fairy was a little puzzled, so I realized that experiments began to be recorded only 10 years ago. She realized that Rio had been completely alone all this time. She felt terrified as Ren realized that he was imprisoned in a dark prison where he was subjected to cruel experiments. Ren was shocked by everything that was happening, but she still knew that she should not cry, but should be strong for her friend. She knew that this information was very important, and therefore she had to remember everything. Ren noticed that the man was leaving somewhere. She decided to immediately follow him. The young fairy noticed that the higher the floor, the more luxurious the surroundings became. She was furiously curious about what was on the top floor. The man came closer to the door and introduced himself. The man asked the burgomaster if he could enter. The young fairy was surprised. She was shocked because she heard the man say, "Burgomeister." It was the lord of the land of the Ulan, the castle, and the prison. The young fairy was shocked because she realized that Rio's owner was outside the door. The burgosister looked at the man and said that he could come in. He looked at the man with a fierce look and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. The young fairy looked intently at the men who were talking. Ren was shocked because she saw Devlik in person Musel. The young fairy looked at them from afar, as she understood that the best solar had a good instinct, and if she came closer, he would immediately understand that she was here. She decided to get a little closer using Fatares of Move. The man looked at the owner and said that there were no special features, and the calibration and strengthening would soon end. The owner looked at the man and said that everything was going more smoothly than he expected, and he also asked when the training would begin. The man looked at the owner and said that they were planning to start training in May. The owner looked at the man with a cold and fierce look and told him to start training immediately. The young fairy decided to come even closer. When using Fatares to move, Ren was trapped in the origin aura, and all sounds and vision were blurred. But if you listen, you can understand what they are talking about. The owner looked at his subordinate and said that the ultimate goal is the Candle Tower in 10 years. He also said that you need to train to go into battle in 4 years. The master looked at the subordinate and said that the king did not want to wait longer than that. The man looked at the owner and said that he would do his best. The young fairy was shocked because she heard that there was a king. She realized that there is a person who is higher than Musel. The young fairy saw a lot of documents on the table. She was wondering if there was any useful information there for her. She saw information about the HIP project for children. She was a little puzzled because she didn't know what a HIP was. But still, she realized that it was something connected with Rio. The young fairy flew unnoticed through the night city among the residents. The young fairy accidentally heard from young people about the HIP weapon. The man smiled and said that he had finally found the HIP weapon. His companion was shocked. He said that such a weapon was simply priceless. He looked at him and asked how much he paid for it. The young lady was shocked as she heard them talking about the HIP weapon. She didn't expect to hear something like this on the street. The young fairy was a little puzzled because she understood that if you listen, you can often hear the name of the HIP. But she didn't know who the HIP was. Ren knew she needed to ask someone better. Ren knew she needed to get information from someone with many connections, and who can easily find such information. She realized that Remy was best suited for this role. The young fairy flew to Remy's office. Rami was very happy to see the young fairy. She greeted Ren with a smile. Remy hugged the young fairy tightly and asked what she was doing in her office at such a late hour. The young fairy smiled and said that she had one question. The young fairy looked at Remy and asked if she knew what a HIP weapon was. Remy said that the Valma manufactory is a weapons factory run by the Valma. The quality is the best in the entire universe. There is no equal, and the options are good. Ramil said that the price of the weapon was simply exorbitant. Since Valka managed the production himself, this is a completely reasonable price. All the powerful weapons used by the children of the HIP were produced there. The fairy looked at her companion and asked how famous the HIP was. Remy looked closely at the fairy and asked if she knew who it was. Remy said that the HIP is the monarch of the fairies. Ren was shocked by this news. She didn't expect to hear something like this. The fairy gains 1 new trait each time she ascends. An ordinary fairy can have only 5 traits. There are a small number of fairies with a 6th trait. This is a small number of fairies who have conquered the Candle Tower, proving your strength and the superiority of your being. They acquire the last feature, transcendence, and they become the patron saint of fairies, and he becomes the fairies' patron, their master. Ren looked closely at Remy and said that she wanted to know more about Velma. She frantically begged her friend to tell her everything she knew. Rami smiled and said that she could not refuse, since the young fairy asks with such shining eyes. Remy looked at the fairy and said that she would definitely tell her everything. Velma was a male fairy, a very powerful fighting fairy. He was very strong and had great recognition in the universe. However, its popularity was also due to its unique nature. The young fairy was puzzled because she did not understand what unique nature we were talking about. Remy was a little embarrassed and didn't know how to answer such a question correctly. Remy said that a real fairy can only have a child with a creature she loves. But Velma was different. What Velma loved was not a living being, but a powerful force. Remy said that everyone said that he only wanted power for himself and wanted an army. He slept with countless women every day, and soon many children were born. Most of the children died, unable to resist Velma's power. But some children survived. After the children grew up in the most powerful Solaroff, they began to be called Velma's children. With his children, Velma challenged the Candle Tower, and finally, 200 years ago, he successfully conquered her. This was the moment the new Fairy King was born. Remy said that he later challenged the top floor of the Candle Tower again and ended up failing. And then all the first children, the Velmas, died. The young fairy was shocked. She looked at her companion and asked if Ace were the first children, that is, the second ones too. Remy said that's how it is, and Velma's story doesn't end there. She said that Velma challenged the Candle Tower several more times, but failed and disappeared. Exactly 30 years later, he showed up again with other children. Remy said that there would probably be more than 100 of Hip's second children. Remy said, puzzled, that there were only 8 officially confirmed children on their planet, 6 of whom died, and the other 2 were missing. Remy looked at the fairy and said that she thought the missing children had been kidnapped, because everyone dreams of a child with such intensity. After her friend's story, Ren understood why Rio was imprisoned in a terrible prison and subjected to painful experiments. The young fairy realized that Rio was the child of the fairy lord. Ren looked at her companion and asked if the fairy monarch was still alive. Remy looked at her friend and said, puzzled, that as far as she knew, he passed away a long time ago. The young fairy was puzzled as she realized that Velma had not done anything to find Rio. Remy looked closely at her companion and asked why she was interested in such information. The young fairy hesitated and said that his weapon was simply very famous. Remy smiled and asked if she was interested in looking in detail at a thing of this kind. Ren now knew that her friend was being bullied because of his terrible background. The young fairy was shocked because she understood that Rio and the other children deserved love and kindness. Rami, in turn, was shocked because she saw that the young fairy was crying. Remy looked at her and asked what happened as she didn't understand why the young fairy was crying. Remy was shocked and wanted to help the young fairy, since she could not bear the thought that the young fairy could cry. Ren, wiping her tears, said that she thought Velma's children were unhappy. She said that this was the first time she had heard such an inhumane story. Remy was puzzled as she now understood why the young fairy shed tears. Remy fell on the table, puzzled, and said that she thought she had said something wrong, and that's why the young fairy. Ren smiled and said that it was not her fault, and also apologized for crying. The young fairy flew closer to her friend and thanked her for her detailed story. Remy smiled and said that the fairy had a very sweet speech. And she also said that if the fairy needed more help, she could always come to her. Ren smiled and thanked her friend. The young fairy smiled and said goodbye to her friend. Remy smiled and wished her a good journey, and also told the fairy to be careful on the road. Remy stared at the retreating fairy. She thought everything had to do with her friend. The young fairy flew to Dr. Dominic's laboratory. She wanted to study all the information. The young fairy found information about Velma's children. Start date January 1st, 688, 13 years ago. The number of children participating in the experiment was 20. On the orders of the test manager, in order to create a powerful weapon, they began a project to raise Velma's children into people lacking self-control. The project aims to enhance abilities that match those of Velma, who specializes in regeneration, incredible strength, and combat. The young fairy was shocked to see the number of children affected. She saw that Rio was also among them. The year 690 was recorded as the main period of destruction. In the 130th month, a tornado of doom engulfed the universe. Among those born in the year 690, only one participant survived, number 20, born on the 13th day, 13th month. He survived the explosion of death energy. Therefore, strong resistance to death is expected. The fairy looked at the notes. She knew it was lucky that Rio survived. But she was a little disappointed because she did not find any information about his biological mother. However, everything that was written in that document was related only to the Rio experiment. The purpose of the experiment was to find a more resilient and strong child. As a result of the administration of the drug, only 4 out of 20 people survived, and among them, Rio turned out to be the most persistent. The young man was the most suitable candidate. The young fairy flew to her friend and called him by name. Fairy, I turned into a human and hugged my friend tightly. Ren asked if he was lonely. The young man called her name in surprise. The young fairy said that she wanted him to listen to something she had to say to him. The fairy smiled and said that it was a little long, but he should listen to her. Some time later, with a sad smile, she said that this was all she had managed to find out. The fairy looked at her friend and asked if it was difficult for him to understand everything she said. The young man said that he understood everything. He looked at the fairy puzzled and said that he was born here, but did not see his mother. Since he is a child, the witches experimented on him. The young fairy looked at him and said that he was very smart, so she was even more annoyed. She knew he was not the kind of child who should be locked up in a place like this. The young fairy burst into tears. She looked at the young man and said that if she were a stronger fairy, she could get them out of such a place. She said that this makes her very angry, since she is still helpless and cannot help him as she wants. The young man looked at his friend and said with a smile that she was strong, not weak. She was shocked and looked at him. The young fairy said that she could not even free him. Rio glared at his friend and said it wasn't her fault. Rio looked at the floor and said that he was the weak one, not her. Therefore, with a trembling voice, he asked her forgiveness. The young fairy was shocked. She said that it was she who should apologize, not him. The young man looked at her and said that she always stayed by his side. Rio said that even though Ren was weak, she gave him delicious food, taught him how to write, and became his friend. Rio looked at his friend and said that she let him know that he was not alone. The young man smiled and thanked her for this. Rio smiled and embarrassedly said that he would also try to be stronger, and then they would escape from the dungeon together. The young fairy looked closely at Rio and said with a smile that it would be so. She said that when they escape, they will eat a lot of delicious food. The young fairy smiled and said that she would certainly introduce him to her friends. The young fairy smiled tenderly and said that they would definitely get out of the dungeon. The young fairy knew that she needed to become stronger. She knew there were some things she needed to do first. To become stronger, a fairy has only 3 ways. The first way is to upgrade your abilities and become a high-ranking fairy. The second is the study and application of a special breathing method. And finally, the third is the tempering of the spirit. The young fairy knew that first she needed to learn the 2-step method of Fatuma breathing by breathing with her whole body. She knew that she needed to temper her spirit, making it strong. The young fairy started playing sports. The young man saw that the young fairy suddenly began to do push-ups and was very surprised. He came closer to her and asked with a smile what she was doing. The young lady smiled and said with a smile that she was training to become stronger. The young man was surprised. The young fairy said that it was all because she wanted to become stronger, so she set herself such a goal. She also said that she wanted to save money, collect information, and become stronger. The young man smiled and looked at the notes in her notebook. He looked at her and asked if she really needed to become stronger in order to do something. The young fairy said, puzzled, that there was one person she wanted to defeat. The young man was surprised, as he did not expect to hear such a thing from her. He looked at her and asked if that was why she wrote that she wanted to get a combat rank. The young fairy smiled and said that then she would be more useful in battle. The young man looked at her and asked if there were other ways to become stronger, except by strengthening the soul, because this method is very complicated. The young fairy smiled and said that there were several more options. He smiled and asked how about finding someone to help her with the enhancement. He said he was talking about a doom hunter who could teach her to use weapons other than the fairy wand. Mamingo said that the hunter could show her how to act on the battlefield. The young fairy smiled and said that this was a very good idea. She said that in this case, she could learn faster and become stronger. Mamingo looked at the fairy and asked how about him. He said he was a solar heptarum. The young fairy was very surprised, as she did not expect this. Fairies breathe through patagram, and people breathe through sulim. The more sulim solar has, the stronger he is, and its quantity is the criterion for assessing rank. If Mamingo, who has 7 sulims, were a fairy, then his rank would be Bacchus, the highest class. The young fairy looked at her friend with surprise and joy and asked to teach her. The young man looked at her and asked if it would be okay if it was a little difficult for her if he taught her. The young fairy smiled and said that it was okay. The young man looked at her intently and said that then they would start by correcting her inept push-ups. The young fairy was shocked by the change in the young man's face. The young man smiled and said that we need to start. That day she saw another Mamingo. After some time in the training room of the 7th zone, The man was training with Rio. The man looked intently at the young man and told him to dodge, and if he touched him even once, they would start all over again. Rio sat motionless on the floor. Rio began full training. The most difficult training took place every day. Rio attacked the man, but still lacked strength. They brought him strange food and told him to eat it all, because it was an order. The food was of poor quality, and the portions were increasing. Rio became stronger every day. The young fairy also did not lag behind him. Together, they tried to grow as much as they could until they became strong. Time passed. In the autumn of that year, the young fairy smiled and happily told her friend that she was able to grow 20 flowers at one time. Ren smiled and said that she felt like she was in a very beautiful flower garden. The young fairy looked at her friend and said that he had also grown well and gained muscle. Ren said that her flowers are full of terra, which means recovery will be faster. The young fairy smiled and called him to sit near the flowers. The young man smiled and sat down. She looked at him and asked if she told him about terra last time. The young man smiled and said that she was telling. He said that terra is the name given to the natural energy that humans and fairies receive when they breathe. Ren said that everything is correct, and terra accumulates in the lungs and is converted into very important energy when meeting the soul. She said that if she meets the soul of a fairy, she becomes a Vita. And if with a human soul, then there will be a hang. When the lungs are filled with Viz, the gates of Sulam's soul will open, and a person will finally become a solar. The fairy said that in fact, the main thing is to feel the terra. Slowly you need to breathe terror mixed with air. The young fairy was surprised as it was impressive. With every breath the realtor took, the person in the room left. The young fairy was surprised and did not know how large the volume of Rio's lungs was. He endlessly devoured terra. The conversion speed is almost instantaneous. I knew that Rio was no longer the same child who was locked in the dungeon. Rio looked at his fairy and said that it seemed that he could open the gates of Sulam's soul. The young fairy was shocked as she realized that Rio's soul was completely filled. She looked at him and flew closer. She quietly told him to open it. Now let's soul it. The young man obediently followed her command. The young fairy was shocked as the energy released was very strong. The flow of energy threw her back, caught the young fairy with lightning speed. The young fairy smiled and looked at the young man. Looking intently at Rio, she said that it was simply magnificent. She smiled and said that he was now a solar. She was surprised because it was the first time she felt such strong energy. The young fairy smiled and said that she knew he was talented, but it turned out that he was a genius. The young fairy began to fly around him in joy. She smiled and said he was an outstanding solar. Rio looked at her and thanked her with a smile for her wonderful words. Unlike fairies, who know about the existence of the soul from the moment of their birth, people without special means cannot know the existence of the soul. The method that people choose to identify the soul, this is an artificial accumulation of viscosity in the lungs. Follow this method from time to time to accumulate a certain amount of viscosity in the lungs, and the person will have the right to open with salt. He opens the entrance to the soul and realizes the existence of the soul. Ren thought that most likely Rio's soul was not full, even when there was enough hanging in it to cause an explosion. This means that Rio's soul is huge. She knew that it was already obvious that he would become the best solar. For this, the most important thing now is definitely If there is OM, then the soul of Rio and the patagram Ren will be able to strengthen and develop. Is usually obtained from kill hunting, but now this is impossible. The young fairy was puzzled and did not know how they could find it. Ren knew that she would still find a way to do this. She knew she had to do this for her friend. Sometime later, the young fairy provided her friend with flowers. The Flora was in shock. Flora was delighted. She looked closely at the flowers and said that they were simply amazing. She looked at the fairy and asked if she could now grow 100 roses. The young fairy smiled and said that it was so. Flora smiled and praised the young fairy. She said that the price for one flower has already exceeded 1,000,000 pitas. The young fairy was shocked. She did not expect the price to rise so quickly. Flora looked at the young fairy and said that the price had gone up while she was away. Flora was told by the fairy that her flowers were unusually special. She said that the roots absorb death and the flowers emit light, and that light drives away the darkness of destruction. Flora knew that the flowers looked like a young fairy. She smiled and said they were truly beautiful. The young fairy smiled and said that she embarrassed her. Flora said that more and more people are looking for her flowers, having learned that they do indeed consume death. Flora looked at the young fairy and said with a smile that if this continues, the young fairy will soon become rich. Remy looked at the young fairy and congratulated her on saving money. She said the money would now accumulate at an astonishing rate. The young fairy smiled and thanked them for their congratulations, and she also said, puzzled, that she needed even more money. The young man looked at her and asked why she needed so much money, since he was sure that she bought herself everything she wanted. The young fairy said that she needed to buy a lot of OM. The young people were shocked because they did not expect to hear something like this. Remy looked at the fairy in surprise and asked if this was all for Rio. The young fairy said that everything is correct and Rio is now undergoing training to become stronger. Remy said, puzzled, that she felt like Rio was the only one benefiting from everything. She looked at the young fairy and asked if he was using her for an hour. Remy said that maybe he was pretending to be weak because he wanted the fairy to do everything he needed. The young fairy said that Rio is a very modest and kind child, and he does not take advantage of her at all. Remy smiled and said she was joking. She also asked when she wanted to buy OM. The young fairy said that most likely next year. She said that she wanted to give him what she had collected with her own hands. The young man said that it was better to make the purchase anonymously through Remy, because if you buy a lot of ohms, you can fall under the gaze of the burgomaster. Remy smiled and said nothing would happen, and everything would be fine so they could leave it to her. The young fairy smiled and told Rima that she was the best. A man came into their bakery and said that he had delivered mail. Mamingo was surprised because he did not expect to receive a letter. Mamingo looked at the man and asked who the letter was from. The man said that the sender was Klondaya, and the recipient was Sharena Berry. Remy opened the letter. Daya asked the young fairy if she was ready for the magical dinner. She wrote that she had been very busy lately, so she could not see her. She also asked if Ren would mind if they met at her place. She also said that she would introduce her to other fairies. Daya wrote that all fairies can be trusted, and she thinks that they can help the young fairy. Remy was surprised and very happy, as she said it would be a good meeting. The young fairy was puzzled. She didn't know if she could go there, since she didn't quite fit. Remy looked at the young fairy and said that of course you can, since this is a very good chance to gain more connections. She looked at the young fairy and said that she had not seen any other fairies except Daya. But still, the young fairy decided to go to the meeting. We are romantic.